Some Jedi Masters are remembered for their battles, others for their wisdom. Qui-Gon Jinn was both. Before he discovered Anakin Skywalker, before his duel on Naboo changed the fate of the galaxy, he was only a boy from Coruscant, quiet, curious, and deeply connected to the Force. Born nearly 80 years before the Battle of Yavin, Qui-Gon entered a galaxy that still believed in peace. The Clone Wars had not yet begun. The Sith were thought extinct. The Jedi Temple stood tall at the heart of the Republic, its halls filled with silence, study, and discipline. Like many before him, Qui-Gon was identified as Force-sensitive in his earliest months. His parents gave him up without protest. It was what families were taught to do, to trust the order, to believe in the greater good. There are no records of his mother's name. No holos of the day they said goodbye. Only a brief note in the temple archive, transferred without incident. Force potential, high. Age, less than 1 standard year. Qui-Gon never spoke of his family. Whether out of loyalty or forgetfulness, no one ever knew. The Jedi taught that attachment was a danger, but even in the creche, instructors noticed how often he would stop and listen. Not to his peers, not to his masters, to something else. In the stillness of the temple walls, Qui-Gon seemed to hear things that others didn't. Not voices, not visions, just something. The creche was where all younglings began. They were raised in groups, fed, taught, and tested together. The goal was unity, but Qui-Gon often drifted toward the edge of the group. He wasn't disruptive. He followed instructions. He passed his lessons, but his eyes would wander. To the skylights, to the garden paths, to the trees swaying in the temple courtyard. He asked questions the instructors weren't used to hearing from a 6-year-old. Not about power or lightsabers, but about the Force itself. Why did it to feel different in the morning than at night? Why was it stronger near the old statues? Why did it sometimes feel sad? Some thought it was imagination. Others saw it as early sensitivity. But it set him apart. During group meditations, while other younglings struggled to quiet their minds, Qui-Gon would sit in stillness for hours. Sometimes he would stay behind after the others had left, still seated in silence, watching a single leaf fall from a temple tree. One of his instructors once asked him what he was listening for. Qui-Gon answered, "The part of the Force that isn't loud." It was the first sign that he didn't see the Force the way most Jedi did. The Council emphasized structure, training forms, mental control, emotional distance. But Qui-Gon, even as a boy, responded to instinct, to the moment, to the flow of life around him. He never said it out loud. But some of the older Padawans began to notice how animals in the temple gardens seemed drawn to him, how he could calm another child with a glance, how he once caught a falling statue before it hit the floor, not by seeing it, but by feeling it begin to tip. There were whispers, even then, that he might be chosen early, that a Jedi Knight would take him as a Padawan before the usual age. But there were also concerns. The instructors logged subtle warnings in his record, emotionally grounded, but unpredictable in application. Relies too often on intuition over instruction. To the order he was promising. To the Force he was listening. And though no one saw it at the time, the path he would walk had already begun to bend away from theirs. The temple was a place of peace, but it was not quiet. From the moment Qui-Gon became old enough to walk the corridors alone, his days were shaped by movement, group drills at dawn, meditation before meals, lessons in galactic history, study of the Force. The temple walls were filled with light, open halls, vast libraries, towering windows that overlooked the skyline of Coruscant. But for Qui-Gon, that light often felt like pressure. Rules came before reflection. Answers were taught before questions could be asked. By the time he was 8, he could recite the Jedi Code word for word. By 10, he had completed his first lightsaber training forms. By 11, he could move objects without touching them. But he still hesitated when the Masters spoke of control. While others focused on manipulating the Force, Qui-Gon tried to feel where it wanted to go. His abilities were strong, but his methods were different, and difference did not always go unnoticed. Master Shoal Maber, an elder instructor in temple philosophy, once said to him during a lesson, "The Force is like water in a stream. Our task is to guide its flow." Qui-Gon asked, "But what if it wants to flood the valley?" The room went quiet, not because the question was wrong, but because no one had ever asked it. He passed his tests, always, but with comments that raised concern. Too curious, overly reflective, too comfortable with uncertainty. Other younglings followed orders. Qui-Gon followed questions. There were moments he didn't understand why the Jedi approached the Force the way they did. So structured, so planned. He wondered why visions were always interpreted through council chambers and never allowed to speak for themselves. Why instinct was treated like danger. He never said this out loud, not directly, but his silence in certain lessons said enough. He began to spend more time alone, not out of rebellion, but out of need. The meditation chambers weren't quiet enough for him. He would walk the upper halls, where few others went, past the archives, past the armory, past the mural of the Prime Jedi carved into stone. There was one corner in the temple that overlooked a stream of hovering transports far below a spot where the hum of the city faded into white noise. Qui-Gon would sit there after lessons, sometimes for hours, not to think, but to feel. When questioned by an instructor about his long absences, he answered, "I'm learning to hear the Force without being told what it should say." The comment was logged. The tone was respectful. But the implication was clear. Qui-Gon was starting to build his own relationship with the Force, one not rooted in tradition, but in experience. At age 12, Jedi Knight Dooku took him as a Padawan. It was considered a great honor. Dooku was precise, brilliant, and powerful. Many believed he would one day join the council. Qui-Gon stood silently at the ceremony, his expression unreadable, his mind already moving. He had spent nearly his entire life behind the temple walls. Now, for the first time, those walls were opening. But even then, something in him knew. He would never fully belong inside them again. The temple gardens were quiet, not by design, but by nature. Tucked deep within the central spire, they were shielded from the city's raw acres of still ponds, old trees, and flowering paths that curved like the flow of a stream. Some Padawans came here to meditate, others to train in silence. But for Qui-Gon, it was the only place that ever felt real. Dooku was a strict master, sharp in thought, careful with praise. His lessons were orderly, demanding, and deeply rooted in Jedi history. But even he noticed Qui-Gon's tendency to wander. Not out of rebellion, but something else. When asked why he spent so much time in the garden, Qui-Gon answered, "It's the only part of the temple that doesn't feel like it was built." The council encouraged natural connection to the Force. But in practice, that connection was always filtered through rules, through codes, through techniques. Qui-Gon didn't ignore those things. He studied them, he practiced them. But he returned, again and again, to the same spot beneath an ancient tree, with curling roots and wide, heavy branches. He would sit there for hours without movement, eyes closed, breathing slow, hands resting against the stone. To others, it looked like stillness. But inside, the Force was moving, not loud, not violent, not like a wave but like wind, shifting, circling, brushing against thought and memory, as if the galaxy itself was breathing. He felt it in the way the pond rippled without wind, in the sound of insects too small to see, in the way certain leaves fell slower than others. No one had taught him to feel this, and no one explained what it meant, not even Dooku. There were moments when Qui-Gon sensed joy in the air, warm, like sunlight, and others when sorrow seemed to rest on the branches, heavy and cold, like waiting rain. He asked Dooku once if the Force could feel emotions. His master replied, "The Force responds to emotion. It does not possess it." But Qui-Gon wasn't sure, because what he felt in those gardens didn't respond to him. It reached toward him. Not always. Not clearly, but in small ways that didn't fade. One day, he saw a wounded bird resting in the brush. Its wing bent, its body shaking. Other younglings had passed by it unaware or uninterested. Qui-Gon didn't touch it. He didn't speak. He simply sat near it, breathing in sync with its trembles, reaching out with nothing but calm. The bird didn't fly away. It stayed until sunset. And by morning, it was gone, but not dead. Qui-Gon never told anyone what happened, not because he feared judgment, but because he didn't have the words to explain it. What he had touched in that moment was something the Jedi didn't speak of, not because it was forbidden but because it wasn't understood. The living Force. It was a concept mentioned in the archives, a branch of Jedi belief focused not on foresight or prophecy, but the present moment, the now, the breath between thoughts, the feeling beneath discipline. Most Jedi treated it as philosophy. Qui-Gon treated it as truth. As the seasons passed, his bond with it deepened. And with every silent step through the garden paths, his footsteps drifted further from the teachings of the temple. Even as his loyalty to the Order remained unchanged, he didn't question the code. Not yet. But he had begun to hear something outside it. Not a voice, not a prophecy, just a presence. And he would spend the rest of his life trying to understand what it was trying to tell him. It wasn't supposed to be a real mission, just a field observation, a minor diplomatic trip with 2 older Padawans and a supervising knight. Qui-Gon had only just turned 13. It was meant to be a lesson in awareness, not interference. The Jedi were mediating a border dispute on the mid-rim world of Shura-Den. Talks were already underway. The temple had no reason to believe violence would follow. Qui-Gon's role was simple: watch, listen, and remain silent. At first, he did. But the moment they stepped onto the cracked stone streets of the capital city, something felt wrong. Not visible, not provable, just wrong. The air was too still, the guards too calm, the people too quiet. He said nothing. Not at first. But as the talks continued inside the palace, Qui-Gon kept watching the crowd gathered at the gates. Mothers holding their children too tightly. Merchants packing up too early. An old man staring at the palace guards without blinking. The Jedi Knight leading the group assured them all was well. That calm was a sign of trust. That the negotiations were progressing. But Qui-Gon felt pressure in his chest. Not fear, not anxiety. Something else. He stepped away from the others, closed his eyes, and listened. The Force didn't speak in words. It never had. But in that moment, it screamed. He ran back inside and interrupted the meeting. He didn't know what he was going to say, only that something terrible was coming. The knight turned, angry at the breach of protocol. The Padawans stared, unsure whether to follow. And then the floor shook. A hidden charge, placed beneath the meeting hall, collapsed the outer chamber. No one died, but several were injured. The talks collapsed, and the Jedi presence was blamed for inciting unrest. When they returned to the temple, Qui-Gon was summoned before a panel, not for punishment, but for questioning. Why had he acted without order? Why had he sensed what no one else did? Why had he chosen instinct over structure? He answered truthfully. He didn't know why, only that it felt like the Force was warning him. One of the masters said gently, "The Force does not shout, young one. If you heard panic, it came from within." Qui-Gon said nothing, but inside, something shifted. He had followed the Force. It had protected them. But instead of trust, he received doubt. Instead of guidance, a warning. He began to understand something he couldn't yet explain, that the Jedi valued harmony more than honesty, that the Council preferred certainty over instinct, and that, listening to the Force, wasn't always the same as obeying it. Dooku did not reprimand him. He offered no lecture, only a short glance and a single line. Next time, know when to speak and when to act. The galaxy does not forgive mistakes. The Order sometimes does. Qui-Gon bowed his head, but his thoughts were far away. That night, he returned to the garden. The wind was still. The stars flickered above the temple roof. He sat beneath the same tree where he had felt the living Force so many times before. But this time, it was quiet, not absent, just waiting. He closed his eyes, slowed his breath, and listened not for words, not for approval, but for truth. Even at 13, Qui-Gon understood something most Jedi took a lifetime to realize. The Force was always speaking. The question was whether anyone wanted to hear what it had to say. Every youngling dreamed of being chosen, not just passed into apprenticeship, but selected, seen, trusted. To train under a Jedi Knight was to step out of childhood and into the galaxy's future. For Qui-Gon Jinn, that day came earlier than expected. He was 12, quiet, intense, thoughtful beyond his years, and his name had already reached the ears of someone few dared to impress. Count Dooku, a warrior of unmatched skill, a scholar of ancient knowledge, respected, feared, admired even within the highest ranks of the Jedi Order. When Dooku entered the temple's hall of selection, the room fell silent. He didn't speak. He simply walked past rows of hopeful eyes until he stood in front of Qui-Gon. The boy didn't move, didn't bow, didn't smile. He just waited. Dooku nodded once. "I will train this one." That was all he said. And that was all it took. Qui-Gon's instructors congratulated him. Other younglings watched in envy. But inside, Qui-Gon felt something colder than pride. He hadn't been chosen because he fit. He had been chosen because he didn't. Their first months together were marked by discipline. Dooku ran his training with military precision. Every gesture measured, every word deliberate. Every failure met with silence, not correction. Qui-Gon studied Dooku's movements, his tone, the way he stood perfectly still in moments of thought. He wasn't a teacher, he was a presence. But underneath that control was something Qui-Gon couldn't name yet. They traveled often to border disputes, minor conflicts, and fading worlds the Senate no longer cared about. Qui-Gon observed. Dooku acted. He ended conflicts before they began, settled negotiations with sentences few dared to challenge, and wielded the Force like it answered only to him. Qui-Gon admired him, but he also feared what he couldn't understand. Dooku didn't raise his voice. He didn't share stories. He didn't speak of the past, only of structure, of purpose, of how the galaxy was drifting from balance. And the more time they spent together, the more Qui-Gon noticed something behind the power, a distance. When asked about the Jedi Council's decisions, Dooku would pause. Then say only, "The council sees what it allows itself to see." When pressed further, he would change the subject. Qui-Gon never argued, but he listened. He began to see the cracks too. In politics, in Jedi diplomacy, in the calm faces of masters who ignored real suffering because the code told them to. Dooku called it wisdom. Qui-Gon wasn't sure what to call it. Their missions became more complex, their bond stronger. But it was not warmth that bound them. It was clarity. They were two minds shaped by silence, two Jedi drawn to truth, but uncertain how to follow it. One night, after a difficult mission, they sat alone in the temple observatory. The stars moved slowly beyond the glass. Dooku said nothing for a long time, then quietly asked, "Do you believe the Jedi can still lead the Republic?" Qui-Gon answered, "I think we try to, even when we don't know how." Dooku didn't respond. He simply stood and walked away. In that moment, Qui-Gon realized something. He had not been chosen to be molded. He had been chosen because he already reminded Dooku of himself. And that meant their future, whatever it became, would not be easy. The galaxy was not as stable as it looked from the temple. Beneath the polished surface of the Republic, Qui-Gon saw cracks. And beside him, Dooku pointed them out not with anger, but with precision. They traveled to systems where peace existed only on paper, where treaties were upheld with threats, where Jedi were used not as guardians, but as symbols of control. Dooku never spoke against the Order directly, but his choices said enough. He often ignored the Council's softer approaches. He negotiated with sharp truths, not calming reassurances. And when conflict couldn't be avoided, he struck first with words or a lightsaber. Qui-Gon watched. He learned, but he didn't always agree. During a mission to Jorax, a planet rich in resources but plagued by corruption, the Jedi were asked to observe nothing more. The Senate had sent aid to the ruling officials, but Qui-Gon saw the aid being withheld. Food rotting in guarded depots, children begging outside government buildings. Dooku told him, "We are not here to fix broken systems, only to maintain the peace." Qui-Gon didn't understand. "What peace?" he asked. Dooku's silence that day was longer than usual, and colder. Over time, Qui-Gon stopped keeping those questions to himself. He questioned the way the Jedi chose sides. He questioned why the code discouraged emotional response when suffering was right in front of them. He questioned how the Council could sit in stillness while entire worlds were swallowed by injustice. The Temple called his questions thoughtful. Dooku called them untimely. They were never arguments, just moments of quiet tension that stretched across star systems. After one mission, Dooku finally spoke clearly. "You must learn when to act and when to observe. Doubt is useful, but spoken too often, it becomes rebellion." Qui-Gon didn't answer. But inside, the seeds had already taken root. He didn't want rebellion, he wanted honesty. There was a moment, during a return trip to Coruscant, when Qui-Gon stood before the Council himself. A small debrief, routine. But he asked a simple question that hung in the air like smoke. Do we serve the Force, or do we serve the Republic? Mace Windu narrowed his eyes. Yoda closed his. The Council answered, "The Force guides the Republic. They are one and the same." Qui-Gon nodded, but something in him disagreed. He told Dooku afterward. His master said nothing for a long time, then replied, "If they were one and the same, we would not need the Council to decide which one to follow." It was the first time Dooku had ever spoken so plainly, and it stayed with Qui-Gon. From that moment on, he began to look at his master differently, not with less respect but with more awareness. Dooku had doubts, deep ones, but he wrapped them in discipline. He acted like a Jedi, even as his faith in the Order slowly faded. Qui-Gon couldn't do the same. When he felt something was wrong, he spoke, and each time, the distance between him and the Council, and between him and Dooku grew wider. He still admired his master, still walked beside him, but he had begun to understand the truth beneath Dooku's silence. The man who had trained him didn't trust the Jedi. Not anymore. And though Qui-Gon still believed, that belief was no longer unshaken. The mission was simple. Observe, report, do not intervene. The world was Telos 4, a place once prosperous, now forgotten by the Republic. Its cities still stood, but its people were tired. The Jedi were sent to assess political unrest after reports of local uprisings, but the Council had made it clear they were not to act without Senate approval. Dooku accepted the order without complaint. Qui-Gon did not question it aloud, but the moment they landed, something felt wrong. The streets were quiet, but the silence didn't feel peaceful. There was no traffic, no voices, just buildings with broken windows and faces that disappeared behind curtains. The local governor greeted them with practiced diplomacy. He spoke of cooperation, stability, minor misunderstandings, but behind him stood guards who watched with their hands too close to their weapons. Dooku read the situation immediately. He warned Qui-Gon to stay alert, but not to provoke. That night, while reviewing temple records in the government archives, Qui-Gon slipped away. Not far, just outside the city wall, where the settlement met the edge of the farmland. He had seen smoke rising earlier. No fire, just smoke. He followed it. What he found wasn't a threat. It was a group of families, camped near an abandoned water plant. Children with sunburned skin and bare feet. Mothers boiling roots in rusty metal pots. They weren't rebels. They weren't soldiers. They were the people the governor had pushed out of the city. And they were dying. No medicine, no clean water, no protection. One of the elders recognized him, not by name, just by his robes. "You're Jedi," she said. "So help." Qui-Gon didn't answer. He stood in silence and listened. There was no anger in the Force, no command, just a quiet pull like it always gave him in moments when something was about to change. He returned to the city, gathered supplies, and broke the rule. Without telling Dooku, without asking the governor, he crossed the wall again. He brought food, water packs, a medical kit. He didn't explain why. He just did what he felt the Force was telling him to do. The next day, the governor found out, accused the Jedi of interfering, demanded they leave. Dooku remained calm. He spoke with authority. He de-escalated the situation with words as sharp as any blade. In front of the governor, he said Qui-Gon acted out of compassion, that no treaty had been violated, that the aid was from their personal supplies. But once they were alone on the transport back to Coruscant, Dooku finally spoke the words he hadn't said in years. "You disobeyed a direct instruction. You undermined our neutrality. You made us visible in a conflict we weren't meant to touch." Qui-Gon didn't respond. After a pause, Dooku added something quieter. "The Force is not always on our side. Sometimes it's a test." Qui-Gon looked out the viewport, toward the stars beyond. "If that was a test," he said, "I wasn't going to fail it." Dooku said nothing else for the rest of the journey. They returned to the temple without incident. The Council never learned the full story, but something between them had shifted. It wasn't anger, it wasn't betrayal, it was distance. Dooku had drawn his lines. Qui-Gon had stepped beyond them, and neither of them would cross back. In time, Qui-Gon would forget the name of the governor. He would forget the flight number. But he would remember the eyes of the child who took the water from his hands. And he would remember that, in that moment, he hadn't felt like a Jedi. He had felt like something else, something truer. The missions didn't stop. The silence between them grew. After Telos 4, Dooku said little. He no longer corrected Qui-Gon's choices, but he no longer guided them either. They worked as Jedi. They traveled together. But the bond that once felt like mentorship now felt like observation, as if Dooku was no longer shaping Qui-Gon, only watching who he was becoming. And Qui-Gon could feel it. There were fewer conversations, fewer shared meditations. Dooku spent more time in the temple archives, researching old texts, many of which the Council no longer studied. Qui-Gon would see him sitting alone in the Great Hall, reading forgotten philosophies, teachings from Jedi who had vanished from the Order's memory. He never asked what Dooku was looking for, because he already knew. He was searching for answers. Answers the Council wouldn't give. Answers the galaxy no longer trusted the Jedi to hold. And still, Qui-Gon didn't walk away. Not from Dooku, not from the Order. Because even though the cracks were showing, even though the code often failed to match the moment, he believed the Jedi could still serve the Force, not the Senate, not the Republic, not politics, just the Force. He believed it because he had felt it. Not in books, not in council chambers, but in gardens, in choices, in the lives they were supposed to protect. One morning, Dooku requested a meeting with the council. He went alone. Qui-Gon waited for hours in the upper training levels. He stood at the balcony edge, watching transports pass over Coruscant's skyline, the endless movement of a galaxy that no longer stopped for anyone. When Dooku returned, his face was unreadable. He simply said, "Your training is complete." Qui-Gon didn't ask what had happened behind those doors. He didn't ask if Dooku was proud. He just nodded. In that moment, the line between them was clear. Master and apprentice no longer. Just two Jedi walking different paths. The knighting ceremony came quietly. No celebration, no speeches. Just a circle of masters, a few silent observers, and the burning away of a braid. Qui-Gon stood tall. He didn't smile. He didn't look for Dooku in the crowd. He knew he was there, watching, always watching. After the ceremony, Qui-Gon left the temple and walked the streets of Coruscant alone. Not to escape, but to feel the world as it was. He passed citizens who had never seen a Jedi. Children playing near supply crates. Vendors shouting over droids in alleys filled with exhaust. No one bowed, no one stared. To them, he was just another robed figure. And to Qui-Gon, that was a reminder of something Dooku had forgotten. The Jedi were not above the galaxy. They were part of it. Weeks passed, then months. Dooku became more distant, traveling alone, refusing certain missions, disagreeing with council rulings in private. Eventually, rumors began that he was considering leaving the Order, that he had lost faith in the council. Qui-Gon never asked if they were true. He didn't need to. He had already felt the moment their paths diverged, not in argument, but in silence. There was no farewell between them, only understanding. Dooku had taught him to see the cracks, but he had also taught him something else, though he never said it aloud. That, even when the path was unclear, you walk it anyway. Qui-Gon would remember that. Not as a rule, but as a lesson his master never taught and maybe never learned. There was no ceremony, no celebration, just a name added to a record, and a new assignment waiting by morning. Qui-Gon Jinn became a Jedi Knight at the age of 20. He was calm, capable, trusted, but inside, he didn't feel any different. The title changed, the missions changed, but the questions never left. He was sent into the Outer Rim first, a border dispute on Garden Prime, a dusty world. Too poor to interest the Senate, too loud to ignore. Two clans, 3 decades of quiet hatred, and 1 Jedi to silence it. Qui-Gon arrived with nothing but a diplomatic packet, a local interpreter, and the same instructions the Council always gave: maintain neutrality, encourage peace, protect life where possible. He followed those words. He sat in long, fruitless negotiations. He listened to old grievances pass through bitter mouths, and when the fighting resumed, he stepped between them without drawing his blade. He stopped a skirmish before it became bloodshed, earned the respect of both sides. The Council called it a success, but the people didn't celebrate. They just went back to surviving. Nothing had changed. Qui-Gon left that world with a strange feeling in his chest. Not regret, not pride. Something emptier. He told no one, but it stayed with him. Over the next 2 years, he was sent to 12 different systems, all different planets, all the same war. Sometimes it was territory, sometimes religion, sometimes a trade route no longer profitable. In every case, peace was the mission, but peace meant different things to different people. To the Council, peace meant order. To the Senate, it meant silence. To Qui-Gon, it meant something he couldn't yet define. There were places where Jedi were welcomed, others where they were feared. But the one thing he saw everywhere, in cities, in ruins, in refugee camps, was exhaustion. People didn't want to fight, they wanted to be heard. But the Jedi didn't have time for that. They were sent to fix problems, not feel them. And Qui-Gon felt everything. He began to keep small notes after each mission, not for record keeping, just for himself. A boy with no shoes gave me his last piece of bread. A woman smiled when I told her the war was over and then asked if it would start again next week. The governor thanked me with gifts. The villagers never came out of their homes. He started to realize something. That peace, when imposed from above, rarely reached the ground. One evening, after a long debrief, Qui-Gon asked his council liaison if the Republic ever planned to visit these worlds once the Jedi left. The Master smiled and said, "Only if the Senate finds it necessary." Necessary. That word stayed with him longer than any lesson he'd learned in the temple. He didn't stop serving. He didn't stop believing in the Jedi. But he began to understand that peace, the kind he was sent to deliver, was not the same as justice. It was cleaner, more presentable, more acceptable to the systems that wrote the rules. And the longer he served it, the more distant he felt from the order that had raised him. He still wore the robes, still followed the code, but the Force, which once felt like a gentle guide, now whispered to him in moments the Council never saw. Not with anger, not with defiance, just quiet questions that the temple no longer asked. Tyshal was meant to be routine, a minor world, a mining colony torn between its workers and its rulers. The kind of conflict the Jedi were often sent to calm, the kind that always seemed the same. Qui-Gon had seen enough of these disputes to know how they ended. A few words, a fragile truce, then silence until the next one began. He arrived with 2 mediators from the Republic Senate. Their robes were pristine, their voices polished. But to the people of Tyshal, they were symbols of the same power that had forgotten them. The mines were dying, the ore was gone, and the company in charge was abandoning the world, leaving the workers without pay or transport. Families trapped in tunnels beneath collapsing stone. Qui-Gon could feel it the moment he stepped off the transport, the anger, the hunger, the despair. It wasn't a Force vision. It was simply there, thick in the air. He told the company's overseer that an evacuation should begin immediately. The man refused. He said the Jedi were guests, not commanders. Qui-Gon wanted to act, but he remembered the Council's words: observe, advise, maintain the peace. He tried to negotiate. He spoke with calm authority, like he had been taught. He warned the overseer that violence was building, and he was right. The first explosion came before dawn. Not an attack, a collapse. A mine shaft imploding, trapping 50 men and women below ground. By the time Qui-Gon reached the site, the survivors were already rioting. The company guards opened fire. The crowd surged forward. He ignited his blade not to kill, but to defend. Bolts of plasma lit the dust, screams cut through the smoke. And in the chaos, Qui-Gon did what the code never trained him for. He chose sides. He deflected fire from the workers. He shouted for calm. But the storm had already begun. And in the center of it, a boy, no older than 12, standing where the crowd met the guards. The blast that killed him was meant for someone else. Qui-Gon caught him before he hit the ground. The boy's breath came shallow, his eyes open, unblinking. And for a brief moment, the Force felt silent. When it was over, the guards had surrendered. The overseer was gone. The miners stood broken among their dead. Tishal was declared stable 3 days later. The Senate withdrew its team. The Jedi Council recorded the event as resolved. Qui-Gon did not argue. He didn't report the child's name. He didn't tell them what he had done. He just said, "Peace has been restored." But when he returned to the temple, the silence followed him. He sat for hours in meditation. No images, no clarity. Only the echo of what he had felt on that world, not the fire, not the smoke, but the stillness afterward. The hollow kind of peace that came when there was no one left to fight. He tried to understand why the Force had not warned him, why it hadn't spoken before the collapse, why it had felt so distant in those final seconds. And for the first time in his life, he wondered if the Force truly guided every moment, or if some tragedies were simply allowed to happen. Dooku's old words returned to him then, uninvited. The Force is not always on our side. Sometimes it's a test. Qui-Gon didn't believe that anymore. Because if it was a test, it wasn't one he had passed. Tishal had been saved. But he would never call it peace. It wasn't a mission. It wasn't even on record. Just a stop between assignments, a quiet moon with no name, no flag, no strategic value. But the distress signal was real. An old frequency, weak, flickering. A call for help that no one had answered in months. Qui-Gon rerouted his ship without permission. The Council would not object. They didn't need to know. The surface was dry and cracked. Ash still clung to the rocks, the memory of a war long since finished. He walked alone into the ruins of a mining camp that no longer existed, and found them. A few dozen people, maybe more. Their faces thin, their clothes faded, eyes that no longer looked up when a ship arrived. They didn't speak at first, didn't ask who he was. They had seen too many uniforms, too many weapons, too many lies. But when Qui-Gon handed a water pack to a mother holding a fevered child, something changed. Not in them, in him. The Force stirred not with urgency, not with danger, with stillness. It was like the garden again, the quiet that held meaning, the kind of silence that didn't ask for action, but presence. He contacted the temple, requested aid, supplies, evacuation. The response was formal. These individuals are not recognized by the Republic. No aid is authorized. Resume original course. That was all. No names, no acknowledgement, no concern. He sat by the refugees that night and watched the fire flicker across broken stone. Some of the children had gathered around him, curious now. Not because of his robes, but because he hadn't left. One of them, a boy with dust across his face, asked, "Are you one of the good Jedi, or the other kind?" Qui-Gon didn't answer. He stayed for 4 days. He treated wounds with the medkit in his ship. He helped rebuild part of a collapsed shelter. He taught the children how to listen for storms before they arrived. He gave away everything he wasn't required to keep. And when it was time to leave, he didn't. He sent another message to the temple. No request, just a report. I will remain here until they are safe. Do what you must. No reply came. The fifth night, a supply ship appeared. Not from the Jedi, but from a small non-profit organization that had intercepted Qui-Gon's message through unofficial channels. 2 volunteers, 2 crates. Not enough for everyone, but more than nothing. When Qui-Gon asked how they knew to come, the woman simply said, "Because someone told the truth." They never asked for credits, never asked who he was. They only said, "Tell us where else the Jedi aren't going." When the last child was aboard the transport, Qui-Gon stood alone on the ridge, watching the engines rise into the dusk. And for the first time in weeks, he felt the force around him, gentle, grounded, and real. Not because of victory, not because of approval, but because he had listened. He returned to the temple without report. The mission had never existed, and no one asked. In the archives, that moon remained unnamed. In the council chamber, the moment never happened. But in Qui-Gon's memory, it became something more than a mission. It became a question. Who do the Jedi serve? When no one is watching, the temple hadn't changed. Its walls were still clean, its corridors still quiet. Its windows still looked out over the galaxy, as if it could still be guided. But Qui-Gon had changed. He walked slower now. Not from age, but from weight. The kind that no one else could see. He no longer lingered after council briefings. No longer spoke in strategy sessions unless he had to. He meditated alone, in chambers others rarely used. And when he taught younglings, he spoke less of control and more of listening. There was a distance now between him and the Order. It wasn't defiance, it wasn't anger. It was something gentler. Sadness, perhaps, or disappointment that never found the words it needed. He still believed in the code, still followed it. But he had stopped pretending that it always worked. He had seen too much. He had seen peace declared over the graves of children. He had seen treaties written with one hand while the other readied weapons. He had seen Jedi bow to political compromise while the Force remained silent in the background. And he had seen how easy it was to serve the mission without serving life. The Council never rebuked him. They never stripped him of rank or title, but they began to send him less, not out of punishment, but because they didn't know where to place him anymore. He was a Jedi who asked too many questions. And the Jedi did not have time for questions. Some masters still trusted him. Some young knights admired him. But more often, he walked alone. He spent his evenings in the upper archives, reading scrolls few others touched, writings on the living Force, ancient cases of Force-sensitive children lost to time, old missions where Jedi had refused the Council's will and disappeared into the Outer Rim. He wasn't looking for permission. He was looking for clarity. He still believed in the Force, with all his heart, but not in the version others spoke about in meetings and lectures. His Force was alive, chaotic, present. It whispered, not commanded. It guided, not ruled. And it didn't always align with what the Order expected. There were days he thought about leaving, not out of bitterness but because he no longer recognized the place he once called home. But each time he stood near the younglings, each time he heard them laugh or ask questions that no one else had time for, he stayed, not for himself, but because someone had to remain to teach them that the Force wasn't something to be used, it was something to be felt. One evening, as the sun bled orange over Coruscant, he stood alone at the edge of the temple's highest garden. The wind moved slowly, the air was warm, and for a brief moment, He imagined what it would feel like to not be a Jedi. To walk into the world with no robes, no blade, no title, just himself. And the Force. He didn't smile. He didn't speak. He just closed his eyes and breathed. Peace, the way the Jedi defined it, had always felt distant to him, like a rule written by someone who had never been to the places he had seen. But in that moment, standing in silence, surrounded by nothing but the sky, he felt something better. Not peace by doctrine, not peace by treaty, just quiet, just presence. The kind the Jedi had forgotten, the kind he never would. The Force spoke to every Jedi, but not in the same way. Some heard it in meditation, some through visions, some only when the Council interpreted it for them. Qui-Gon heard it differently, not in dreams, not in prophecy, but in the present, in breath, in instinct, in silence that pulled at the edge of a moment. It didn't start all at once. It came slowly. On one mission, a diplomatic meeting stalled in a crowded hall. The negotiations were calm. The guards looked relaxed. But Qui-Gon felt something. A chill in the air. A tightening in the stomach. A sound that didn't belong, not a noise but a pause between sounds. He turned, saw a figure trying to blend into the wall, and stepped forward just as the man reached for a hidden blaster. The attack never happened. The delegates never knew. Qui-Gon simply stood in front of the ambassador and said, "This one has fear in his blood." Later, when asked how he knew, he didn't offer evidence. He said, "The Force told me." The Jedi Knight accompanying him raised an eyebrow. The Council gave no comment, but something subtle shifted. After that, it happened more often. A wrong turn avoided. A harmless traveler revealed to be something else. A delay that saved lives. He stopped calling it coincidence. He stopped needing proof. In time, he stopped explaining himself. The Force had always felt alive to him, but now it was personal, responsive, present. It wasn't guiding him toward the future. It was showing him the truth of the moment, if he was willing to feel it. He began to trust those feelings. More than orders, more than plans. The Jedi didn't forbid instinct, but they didn't rely on it either. They taught patience, structure, clarity of thought. But Qui-Gon learned something else. That sometimes the Force didn't want him to wait. Sometimes it wanted him to move. He once left a safe zone during an escort mission, alone, without approval. The diplomats protested. The Jedi overseeing the route warned him of the breach. But in the ravine just beyond the planned path, he found the sniper, lying in wait, breathing slow, undetected by every sensor the Republic had placed. When asked how he knew, he simply said, "The wind changed." And no one understood what he meant. In moments like those, Qui-Gon began to feel the edges of something deeper. Not a power, not a secret, but a relationship. The Force wasn't just energy. It wasn't just something to move or control. It was something alive. And if he listened, truly listened, it could speak to him through anything. The sway of grass, the way animals paused before a quake, the way a room fell too quiet before something broke. It didn't speak in sentences. It spoke in presence. And he realized most Jedi didn't hear it because they weren't taught to. They were taught to suppress reaction, to analyze feeling, to silence emotion. But in doing that, they dulled something sacred. Qui-Gon began spending less time in formal meditation and more time in motion. He walked unfamiliar paths through temple gardens. He sparred blindfolded. He let himself feel the room before stepping into it. And he noticed things. That the Force around people changed when they lied. That it pulsed differently in places where great sorrow had been buried. That sometimes it felt urgent even when no one else sensed anything at all. He never claimed superiority. He never taught these things, because he knew what the council would say. Instinct is not trust. Feeling is not fact. There is no emotion. There is peace. But Qui-Gon knew something else now. Peace wasn't always stillness. Sometimes it was movement, the kind that saved lives without anyone knowing they were in danger. He continued to serve. He followed missions. He obeyed the code. But piece by piece, he began to follow something deeper. Not his heart, not rebellion, just the Force, as it truly was alive, breathing, speaking, even when no one else was listening. The council always believed in preparation. They planned every step, every landing, every conversation. For them, peace was a formula. But for Qui-Gon Jinn, peace was never predictable. It began on Ord Padren, a humid world, half jungle, half settlement, a colony torn between a corporate syndicate and the farmers who fed its people. The council sent Qui-Gon and 2 other Jedi to mediate. Their mission was clear: prevent escalation, do not interfere, wait for Senate authorization before acting. The plan was meticulous and wrong. From the moment Qui-Gon arrived, the Force felt restless. The air was heavy, the insects quiet. Even the leaves moved without wind. Something was off. The others didn't feel it. They saw order. He felt warning. That night, the syndicate arranged a truce, a symbolic feast to ease tensions. The farmers gathered in the open courtyard. Music, lanterns, guards lined the walls with weapons holstered. But beneath the sound of laughter, Qui-Gon heard something. A pattern in the hum of machinery, a faint vibration underfoot. And then, like breath freezing in his chest, he knew. He stood abruptly, walked straight toward the center of the courtyard, and without speaking, ignited his lightsaber. The crowd froze. The other Jedi looked confused. And then the ground split open. The explosion tore through the lower levels of the structure enough to level the compound. But Qui-Gon's warning had forced people away from the blast radius just in time. No one died. Not one. When the dust settled, the others found him kneeling, blade extinguished, eyes closed. He wasn't meditating. He was listening to the Force, to the way it hummed softly again, as if satisfied. He stayed there until the last of the smoke cleared. The investigation later revealed the syndicate's plan to frame the farmers, destroy the truce, and seize full control of the colony's resources. Qui-Gon's instinct had saved them all. But that wasn't what the council saw. In their report, they questioned his methods. Why had he drawn his weapon before confirming a threat? Why had he disrupted negotiations? Why hadn't he waited for proof? Qui-Gon didn't defend himself. He simply said, "The Force warned me." The council's response was careful, measured. Feelings can be mistaken. The Force does not command. It guides. But Qui-Gon already knew what that meant. They didn't believe him. They believed in procedure. Later that night, Master Mace Windu found him meditating in the archives. He told him, "You did the right thing, but the council fears what they cannot teach." Qui-Gon looked up and said softly, "Then they've stopped learning." Windu didn't respond. He simply placed a hand on his shoulder and left. It wasn't defiance that grew in Qui-Gon, after that it was distance. He didn't hate the council. He didn't even resent them. He just understood, finally, that they didn't hear the same Force he did. Theirs was cosmic, far-reaching, political. His was intimate, breathing, alive. When others sought visions of destiny, Qui-Gon listened for the moment. When others looked to prophecy, he looked to life. To what the Force was saying now. He saved hundreds that night. But something else was lost. The council no longer saw him as predictable. and the trust that once held him inside their circle began to thin. From then on, his missions changed. Fewer political assignments, more border disputes, more distant worlds. Quietly, they began to send him where others would not go, where his instincts could be useful but unseen. It wasn't exile, it wasn't punishment, but it was the first step toward solitude. Qui-Gon accepted it without protest, because the truth was simple. He didn't follow orders anymore. He followed the Force, even when it led him alone. The Force is never wrong. That's what Qui-Gon believed. Until the day it was. It happened on Shadak 9, a fractured mining world orbiting a dying star. The planet's crust had begun to tear itself apart after years of drilling. Entire cities slid into the molten cracks that opened beneath them. The Senate wanted order restored. The Jedi wanted to prevent panic. Qui-Gon was sent with 2 knights. Their orders were simple: secure the evacuation, protect the planetary governor, avoid unnecessary risk. But the moment they arrived, Qui-Gon felt something beneath the chaos. A pull, a warning, a whisper from the Force that tugged him toward the lower sectors where civilians had been reported missing. The others dismissed it. There were no life signs down there, only seismic instability. The evacuation zone was elsewhere, safer, predictable, but Qui-Gon couldn't ignore it. He told the lead knight, "The Force wants me to go below." The knight frowned. "The Council wants us above." And that was the end of the argument, or should have been. But Qui-Gon left anyway. He descended alone into the tunnels, through the dust and flickering light, guided by that feeling, not loud but certain. He found them, dozens of civilians huddled beneath the main structure, too afraid to climb, believing the surface was already lost. Their fear was thick, suffocating. He reached out, told them to follow him. He promised they would make it, and for a moment it seemed like the Force had led him true, until the quake began. The floor split open as the upper levels collapsed. Screams, fire, darkness. He grabbed whoever he could, pushing them toward the narrow lift. He reached the platform as the ceiling fell. Only a few escaped. When Qui-Gon awoke, he was surrounded by rubble and silence. The rest were gone, buried, crushed. He called out through the Force a desperate, silent plea. But the echo that came back wasn't guidance. It was grief. Hours later, the rescue team found him, burned, bleeding, still trying to move the stones with the last of his strength. He didn't speak for days after the recovery, didn't meditate, didn't eat. The Council commended him for bravery. They said his actions saved some lives that would have been lost. But they also said his decision had broken protocol and cost more lives than it had saved. He accepted their judgment. He didn't argue, because he wasn't angry with them. He was angry with himself. He had trusted the feeling, he had obeyed the whisper, and it had led him into fire. For the first time, doubt crept in. Not about the Force, but about whether he could truly hear it, or if he was only hearing himself. He tried to meditate again. He sat for hours in silence. But where the Force had once been alive and close, now it was distant, like something ashamed or disappointed. The healers told him the guilt was natural. That Jedi were not meant to carry the weight of every life. But Qui-Gon couldn't let it go. He began to avoid the other knights. He refused new missions for several weeks. And when he did return to duty, his calm was different. It wasn't peace, it was surrender. He followed orders again. He spoke little. He moved carefully, almost fearfully, as if one more wrong feeling could destroy what little trust remained between him and the Council. But inside, something still called to him. Not as a command, not as redemption, just as presence. The living Force hadn't abandoned him. It had gone quiet, waiting for him to understand that listening isn't about being right. It's about being willing, and though the council would never know it, that tragedy changed Qui-Gon forever. He didn't lose faith. He found it again, deeper, slower, and heavier. Faith that accepted failure as part of truth. Faith that learned to hear even in silence. The others saw a Jedi scarred by loss, but the Force saw something else. A man still willing to listen. Even after the sound was gone, the temple had not changed. Its halls were still filled with light, its voices still calm, its wisdom still untouched by the chaos outside. But Qui-Gon no longer belonged to it. He walked through those marble corridors like a guest, nodding where expected, speaking only when required. Not out of pride, out of understanding. The council no longer asked him for insight. They asked him for compliance. He gave them silence instead. To the younglings, he was still a teacher, but he taught differently. He asked questions instead of giving answers. He let them feel their way through the Force, not memorize it. The instructors called it unconventional. The archivists called it unsourced. But the children listened, and sometimes the Force responded. In quiet corners of the temple, they began to say his name differently, with caution, with distance. He hadn't broken the code, he hadn't betrayed the order, but he no longer walked in rhythm with it. He spent his nights walking the gardens again, just like he had as a child. Only now the quiet felt heavier. The Force was still there, still speaking, but it spoke through shadows now, through things left unsaid, through the way people looked away when he entered a room. He had once dreamed of joining the council. Now, he couldn't imagine sitting in that circle, because he had learned something they had forgotten. The Force did not belong to the Jedi, and the Jedi did not always follow the Force. It wasn't rebellion, it wasn't arrogance, it was truth. And truth, in a place built on tradition, was dangerous. He was summoned one morning for a private conversation with Master Ki-Adi Mundi. The Sarian didn't accuse him of anything. He simply said, "Your methods cause confusion. Others begin to question." Qui-Gon replied, "Then let them question." The Master paused, then asked, "And if that questioning leads them away from the order?" Qui-Gon looked him in the eye and said, "Then maybe they were meant to walk somewhere else." That conversation was never recorded, but the message was received. From that day forward, Qui-Gon was no longer consulted. Not on policy, not on training, not on vision. But the strange part was he didn't mind. Because the Force hadn't left him. It was clearer now than ever before. Not louder, just closer. Like it had been waiting for him to finally stop trying to explain it, and simply follow it. On missions, he no longer asked for detailed plans. He asked for time. Time to feel the place, to listen to its pain, to walk the streets, to sense the moment before it arrived. And again, the Force answered. He prevented attacks before they were launched, found truths that others missed, saved lives others didn't even know were in danger. But each success widened the distance, because he couldn't explain how he knew, and the Order couldn't accept what they couldn't measure. They began calling him a maverick, a risk, a Jedi who walked too close to the edge. And maybe they were right, because Qui-Gon was no longer trying to stay inside the lines. He was trying to stay true to the Force, even if it led him outside the map. He still wore the robes, still carried the blade, still served the people. But the Order saw what they feared most. A Jedi who listened to something older than tradition, something deeper than doctrine. A Jedi who followed the Force, even when the Council said no. He didn't argue. He didn't preach. He simply walked. And in doing so, he became something rare. Not a warrior, not a scholar, Not a prophet, but a voice the temple couldn't control. Because it didn't come from them. It came from the Force. He wasn't looking for a Padawan. Not then. Not after what happened with Xanatos. That failure still clung to Qui-Gon's name like a shadow. Whispers in the hall. Questions in council meetings left unspoken. The kind of loss that didn't just break trust, it broke rhythm. The rhythm between master and apprentice. Between heart and instinct. So when the Order suggested Obi-Wan Kenobi, Qui-Gon almost said no. The boy was young, just 13, but sharp, precise, focused. A perfect example of temple discipline. He answered every question with confidence. He moved with control, and he never interrupted. Qui-Gon saw it immediately. He wasn't arrogant. He wasn't lost. He was exactly what the Council wanted a Jedi to be, and that's what unsettled him. During their first trial mission, an off-world diplomatic escort, Obi-Wan stayed 5 paces behind Qui-Gon at all times. He only spoke when spoken to. He bowed to every official, memorized every name, followed the itinerary with word-for-word clarity. And yet, Qui-Gon felt something missing. Not skill, not effort, something else. They sat alone on the transport deck the night before arrival. The stars moved slowly beyond the glass. Qui-Gon asked him a question, quiet, casual. "What does the Force feel like to you?" Obi-Wan straightened. "It feels like calm, Master." Qui-Gon waited. "And control," the boy added. "It gives me purpose." He said it like he had practiced it, like an answer pulled from a lesson, not a feeling. Qui-Gon didn't challenge him. He only nodded. But inside, he knew. The boy was listening too well. He had been taught what to say, what to think, what to silence inside himself. And he had done it perfectly. Too perfectly. Qui-Gon remembered being that age, sitting by temple windows, hearing the Force move in places no one else noticed. He remembered asking questions no one could answer, feeling things that didn't match the code. And here, before him, sat a boy who had buried every question just to fit the mold. That was why Qui-Gon said yes, not to train him, to free him. The Council was surprised. They had expected resistance. Qui-Gon offered none. He accepted Obi-Wan as his Padawan. And the first lesson began before either of them knew it. Not with lightsabers, not with meditation, but with silence. Because Qui-Gon didn't teach the way others did. He didn't lecture. He didn't recite. He waited, and Obi-Wan, used to structure, didn't know what to do with that. On their next mission, the boy double-checked every protocol. He corrected locals on diplomatic terms. He reminded Qui-Gon of their timeline twice, and Qui-Gon let him. But on the third day, when a village elder wept in front of them, Obi-Wan hesitated. The scrolls said to maintain distance, but the Force said otherwise. Qui-Gon stepped forward, knelt beside the man, placed a hand on his shoulder and said, "We hear you." Obi-Wan didn't move, but something shifted in his face. He had seen something he didn't understand. Later that night, he asked, "Master, why did you break protocol?" Qui-Gon said, "Because the moment needed me more than the plan." Obi-Wan frowned. "But if we all did that?" Qui-Gon looked at him gently. "We don't all feel it the same way." And Obi-Wan said nothing more. Not because he agreed, but because part of him wanted to. Qui-Gon saw it. The first crack in the wall. The first question the boy hadn't been taught to ask. And in that quiet moment, he made a decision he hadn't made in years. He would not shape Obi-Wan into a Jedi. He would unshape him first. Not to weaken him, but to give him back what the temple had taken. A voice, a choice, a bond with the Force that was personal, not procedural. Because in Obi-Wan, Qui-Gon saw not what the galaxy needed, but what it might still deserve. Someone who could listen but also decide. Their first year together was not peaceful, not hostile, but never truly aligned. Obi-Wan woke early, prepared thoroughly, spoke carefully, trained constantly. He did everything the Order expected, everything Qui-Gon did not. They argued not in raised voices, but in quiet tension, in pauses too long, in questions left unanswered. In the moments after missions, when the silence said more than any report, Qui-Gon didn't seek conflict, but he didn't hide his disapproval either. When Obi-Wan quoted the code, Qui-Gon asked what it meant. When Obi-Wan followed plans, Qui-Gon changed them mid-mission. When Obi-Wan hesitated, Qui-Gon moved first. To Obi-Wan, it felt like rebellion. To Qui-Gon, it was correction. The galaxy didn't follow the rules. So why should its protectors? One mission took them to Teia, a fractured planet in the mid-rim, governed by uneasy treaties and historical wounds. A royal convoy had gone missing. The council suspected a political rival. Qui-Gon suspected something else. They arrived at the capital under tight security. Obi-Wan studied the data, interviewed witnesses, constructed a timeline, but Qui-Gon walked the outer streets. He spoke with farmers. He watched the birds. He felt the wind shift between districts. After 2 days, Qui-Gon announced they were leaving the capital. He said the convoy had never been kidnapped, just hidden by the royal family itself, to stage a rescue and win support for a coming election. Obi-Wan objected. "There's no evidence. There's the Force," Qui-Gon said. Obi-Wan clenched his jaw. "We have no authorization to act." Qui-Gon smiled faintly. "We won't act. We'll observe. Until we're needed." They found the convoy on the 3rd night unharmed, hidden in a storage bay beneath the palace. The political scheme was exposed. No one died. But the council's report criticized their deviation from protocol. Obi-Wan brought the data pad to Qui-Gon's quarters. Frustrated. "They warned us. They're watching now." Qui-Gon didn't look up from his tea. "They've always been watching." Obi-Wan didn't understand how someone could care so deeply and still refuse to obey. And Qui-Gon didn't understand how someone so intelligent could still believe rules were truth. But the friction taught them more than harmony ever could. It showed Qui-Gon where Obi-Wan's walls were. And it showed Obi-Wan how different the galaxy looked without them. They never said it aloud, but each mission bent them closer to one another. Not because they agreed, but because they had to move together or fail. There was a moment on Palax when everything turned. A storm had shattered a transport in orbit. The wreckage had rained down across the capital. Fires, panic, a city in freefall. Qui-Gon rushed into the streets, guiding people from rubble. But it was Obi-Wan who pulled a child from the flame. Obi-Wan who jumped without orders, without protocol, just instinct. When they returned to the safety zone, Obi-Wan looked shaken, but changed. "I didn't think," he said. "You listened," Qui-Gon replied. And Obi-Wan nodded. That moment stayed between them, unspoken, but remembered. It wasn't trust yet. Not fully, but it was the first time Obi-Wan saw defiance not as disorder, but as service. Service to life, to people, to the Force as it actually moved, not how the Council hoped it would. Their tension never vanished, but beneath it, something stronger began to form. Not agreement, understanding. Obi-Wan didn't become Qui-Gon, and Qui-Gon didn't try to shape him anymore. Instead, they moved through the galaxy like a blade and a hand, sharp where one was soft, measured where one was bold. It wasn't harmony, but it was balance. And for Qui-Gon, that was enough. Because Obi-Wan wasn't just becoming a Jedi, he was becoming himself. It wasn't the kind of mission that made it into history. Just a backwater world, a broken truce, and a last-minute request from the Council. One more fragile thread in a galaxy full of unraveling ones. They were sent to Breen, a system with no strategic value, barely charted, forgotten by the Senate unless trade was threatened. And now it was. A border town had been attacked. Two factions blamed each other. The usual cycle. Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan were told to investigate, to calm, to prevent escalation. It began quietly. They walked the perimeter, spoke to local militia, reviewed reports, but nothing added up. The attack hadn't left any traces. No bodies, no fire, just fear. Then the second attack came, and this time they were there when it happened. A sudden strike from the cliffs. Explosives detonated in a civilian square. Panic erupted. Blasters fired in every direction. Qui-Gon didn't hesitate. He moved through the smoke, not toward the explosion, but away from it, toward the hill where no one was looking. Obi-Wan followed. Not because he understood, because he trusted. They found the raiders not from either faction, but outsiders. Mercenaries hired to destabilize the region and profit from the aftermath. There were more than expected. Too many. They fought, side by side. But even together, they couldn't hold the ground. Qui-Gon took a hit across the shoulder. Obi-Wan pulled him behind cover. They were pinned, wounded, outnumbered, no way back to the settlement. They stayed hidden until nightfall, listening, breathing. The firelight of their attackers flickered across the rocks. And in that stillness, Obi-Wan spoke. "You knew." Qui-Gon didn't respond. "You knew they weren't from here. Before the second attack." "I felt it," Qui-Gon said quietly. "You always feel it." There was no anger in Obi-Wan's voice, no accusation. Just something like awe, or confusion, maybe both. He looked at his master, blood on his prost robes, eyes closed in focus. Not afraid, not shaken, just present. "How do you trust it?" Obi-Wan asked. "The Force?" Qui-Gon said. Obi-Wan nodded. "In the middle of all this, when nothing makes sense," Qui-Gon opened his eyes. "Because I don't need it to make sense. I only need it to be real." That night, they moved. Not with plans, not with backup, but with instinct. They circled the camp, used the shadows, cut a path not to win but to warn. They sent a signal to the town, exposed the location of the mercenaries, and vanished into the valley before dawn. The local factions united briefly to repel the threat. The truce held, the planet quieted, but something else changed. Not in the mission, in Obi-Wan. When they returned to the temple, he didn't go to the archives. He didn't write a report. He went to the meditation chamber and sat, not to think, to feel. He began to understand what his master had never said aloud. That service to the Force wasn't always clean, and the code, while noble, couldn't hold every moment. There were times when action was wrong, and silence was wrong, and all that remained was the now, the breath before choice, the heartbeat before truth. Obi-Wan didn't abandon the teachings. He didn't forget the code, but he stopped fearing the spaces between it, and Qui-Gon saw it, saw the way his apprentice moved through missions differently now. Not faster, not louder, just deeper. He didn't obey without thought anymore, and when he disagreed, he said so. They still argued, but now, the space between them was alive, not with friction, but with honesty. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, and in a galaxy full of illusion and fear, that was enough. Qui-Gon had not chosen Obi-Wan to be a mirror. He had chosen him to be a future. And for the first time, he began to believe that he might become one. Time passed differently for Jedi, measured not by age, but by growth, by failure, by the silent space between teacher and student that either closes or hardens. For Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan, that space had closed, not with ease, not with agreement, but with trust. A trust built on pain, defiance, and the quiet decision to keep walking together anyway. Obi-Wan was no longer the boy who clung to doctrine. He didn't flinch at instinct. He didn't wait for permission. But he hadn't become Qui-Gon either. He had become something else. He began to make decisions on his own. He asked fewer questions, not out of rebellion, but because he was learning to listen to the Force in his own way. Not as his master did, but honestly, without fear. Qui-Gon watched this with something more than pride. It was relief. For years, he had carried a quiet fear that he would fail again, that he would shape another apprentice who followed him, only to fall. But Obi-Wan didn't fall. He learned where to question, where to trust, where to stand alone. And he did so with a calm that Qui-Gon had never fully known himself. There were moments when Qui-Gon would watch his apprentice from a distance during training, during missions, during silence. And he began to understand something he hadn't allowed himself to feel before. Obi-Wan didn't need him, not anymore. And that was the measure of success. But with that truth came another. He wouldn't be able to protect him forever. It wasn't a premonition. It wasn't dread. Just a feeling, the kind that didn't demand action, only recognition. Something in the Force had begun to shift, and though Qui-Gon could not see its shape, he felt its pull. A tide rising far beyond the walls of the temple. A disturbance that no vision had captured, but that every breath now carried. He kept it to himself, taught Obi-Wan as if there would be years left, walked beside him like the path ahead was long and clear. But in his quietest moments, he listened, and the Force told him what no one else would. His time was thinning. One afternoon, Obi-Wan sat across from him in the meditation chamber. The sunlight painted the floor with soft lines. Neither of them spoke, and then Obi-Wan asked, "Master, do you believe I'll be ready?" Qui-Gon opened his eyes. "For what?" "For when you're not here." There was no emotion in the question, just readiness, just truth. Qui-Gon looked at him for a long moment, and then said softly, "You already are." He didn't say it to reassure. He said it because it was true. And Obi-Wan nodded. Not as a student, as a Jedi. That night, Qui-Gon walked the garden paths alone, the same ones he had walked as a child, where the wind once whispered to him, where the living Force had first made itself known. He placed a hand on the old tree where he used to sit. Its bark was rough, cracked by age, but still alive, just like him. He whispered, "Protect him when I can't." He didn't expect an answer, but the wind moved anyway. Later that year, the council would send them to Naboo, to negotiate, to settle a dispute. A simple mission, and Qui-Gon would go without hesitation, because he had taught all he could, and because he had finally found what he never thought he would again: hope. Not in the council, not in prophecy, not in peace, but in a single apprentice who could still carry it forward. Before Obi-Wan, before defiance, before the whispers of the council's distrust, there was Xanatos, Qui-Gon's first apprentice, and his greatest failure. The boy had been exceptional, quick-minded, skilled with the blade, fluent in diplomacy before he could even construct his first lightsaber. The Order praised him, called him promising, said he would one day join the council itself. Qui-Gon had believed it, had seen in Xanatos the sharp brilliance of a Jedi, unafraid to act a student who could question without losing his way. Someone who, maybe, didn't need to be broken to serve the Force. But brilliance hides many things, and Qui-Gon didn't see what lived beneath it. Pride, ambition, a hunger for meaning that the Jedi didn't know how to feed. They served peace, but Xanatos wanted purpose. It began small, a mission to Telos, his homeworld. A return meant only to calm unrest, political division over corporate greed and planetary policy. Xanatos asked to lead. Qui-Gon agreed. He thought it was time. He believed in his student. He trusted the Force would guide him, but he didn't know what Telos would awaken in him. The people welcomed Xanatos like royalty. They knew his name, praised his family, and in return, he stood taller. Too tall. He began making decisions without counsel, speaking for the Jedi before consulting his master, commanding troops, influencing policy, shifting allegiances with confidence and arrogance. Qui-Gon tried to step in, tried to slow him down, but it was too late. The mission had shifted. Xanatos wasn't mediating, he was claiming. He had been raised by the Jedi. But Telos had made him feel like a king. When Qui-Gon confronted him, Xanatos didn't deny it. He defended it. He said the Jedi were too afraid to lead. That peace meant nothing without control. That power wasn't dangerous, it was necessary. And in that moment, Qui-Gon saw something he hadn't expected. Not a Sith, not a monster, just a boy who had tried to make sense of the galaxy and decided the Jedi were too slow to matter. Qui-Gon could have walked away, could have let the Order deal with it, but he didn't. He fought him, lightsaber against lightsaber, not to win, to stop him, and he did. But not before something else broke. Xanatos escaped, disappeared into the galaxy, and Qui-Gon returned to the temple with a silence inside him that never fully healed. The council treated it as tragedy. They consoled, they offered time, but no one questioned how it had happened. No one asked what they had missed, and Qui-Gon began to wonder if the Jedi could produce someone like Xanatos, train him, shape him, praise him, and still lose him. Then, what was the system really protecting? He blamed himself, but not entirely, because the truth was, Xanatos had learned more than just how to use the Force. He had learned how to hide inside it. And the Order, in all its wisdom, had never looked closely enough. They had seen discipline, they had seen talent, but they had never seen the shadow growing beneath it. Qui-Gon had, but too late. And from that day forward he made a choice. He would never trust brilliance again. Only honesty, only presence. He would never confuse power with promise. Never let success blind him to truth. It wasn't fear. It wasn't guilt. It was grief, quiet and cold. Grief for a student who had turned back. Grief for a master who had not stopped him. And grief for an Order too proud to ask how it happened. When the council offered him another apprentice a year later, he refused. Not because he couldn't teach, because he wasn't sure anyone was ready to learn. He brought his doubts to the council, not with anger, not with blame, just questions, but questions were enough. They listened as they always did in silence, their eyes calm, their posture still, their judgment hidden behind the same composed faces that had trained him. He told them what he had seen in Xanatos, how ambition had taken root not in defiance, but in the spaces the Order refused to fill. How the boy had followed rules, and still lost himself. He asked them to change something, anything, to examine what they praised, to look closer at what they ignored. But they thanked him for his insight, and offered no change. They called it an isolated case, a tragedy, an exception. They did not see the pattern, or refuse to. Qui-Gon stood in the center of the chamber, surrounded by wisdom, and realized he was alone. It wasn't defiance he felt. Not yet. Just distance. Like the room had shifted. Like the voices that once guided him were now echoes in a hall he no longer trusted. He left without protest. But inside, something had gone quiet. Not his belief in the Jedi. His belief in their leadership. From that day on, Qui-Gon stopped bringing concerns to the council, not out of bitterness, but because they would not hear them. He still obeyed, still carried out missions, still walked the halls of the temple with the dignity expected of a Jedi Master. But his questions grew louder in silence. He began to see other students, quiet ones who hesitated before answering, who asked about emotions they weren't supposed to feel, and he saw how quickly the order corrected them. How gently, but firmly, the temple trained questions out of its children, not with cruelty, but with expectation. He began to visit the archives more often, not for history, but for patterns. He read of other Jedi who had walked too far, of masters whose instincts conflicted with orders, of students who glimpsed futures the council never approved of warnings that had come too early and been ignored until it was too late. He found them buried in footnotes, mentioned only in failure, never explored in full. The order kept its records clean. But Qui-Gon had learned to read the spaces between words. He wasn't looking for rebellion. He was looking for truth. And what he found was silence. A silence that repeated itself across generations. He thought of Dooku, his old master, once proud, once trusted, now gone, not fallen, not hunted, just missing. And he began to wonder if silence had followed him too. If Dooku had also once stood in that same chamber with truth on his lips and stillness in response. The thought lingered, not as fear, as warning. The order wasn't corrupt. It wasn't cruel. It was rigid, and in its effort to remain pure, it had stopped moving. The Force did not stop moving. Qui-Gon knew this. He felt it every day in breath, in instinct, in the gentle pull that guided him beyond logic. But the council no longer followed the current. They had anchored themselves, and now they waited for the galaxy to come to them. He knew they meant well. He knew they believed in peace. He still believed in them, but not blindly. He had seen what silence could do to a student, to a master, to an entire order. And he knew now, silence was not wisdom. It was fear in disguise. They never said it out loud, but the message was clear. After Xanatos, after the questions, after the silence in the council chamber, Qui-Gon's assignments began to change. They were still important, on paper, but they no longer came with urgency. No longer called for deep counsel or diplomatic weight. He was sent to the edge of the galaxy, to places the council rarely visited. Settlements caught between treaties, trade disputes in half-forgotten sectors. Fleeting tensions that needed quiet resolution, not careful insight. Some would have called them punishments. Qui-Gon didn't. He called them what they were: distractions. Ways to keep him moving. Away from Coruscant, away from the temple, away from influence. But he accepted every mission, without protest, without complaint. Because, in the stillness of the outer rim, the Force still moved. And sometimes, it whispered clearer than it ever had within the temple. He visited mining colonies carved into frozen cliffs, spoke with tribal leaders who had never seen a lightsaber before, watched children learn to defend themselves with nothing but belief and fear. He saw the galaxy the council never visited, the parts that didn't fit on datapads. Here, peace wasn't negotiated, it was survived. And he began to understand what the Jedi had forgotten, that the Force didn't belong to the temple. It didn't echo louder in marble halls. It didn't wait for votes in circular chambers. It moved through all things, even here, even in silence. He helped when he could. A village caught in the middle of a corporate land seizure. A freighter captain haunted by visions she didn't understand. A world on the brink of war over a riverbed with no water left in it. The council never asked for details, only results. He sent them what they wanted. Peace secured, conflict resolved, balance maintained. But he kept the real stories to himself. The child who saw his dead father in his dreams, only to wake with the ability to sense the emotions of others. The warrior who laid down her weapons after hearing a voice during meditation, a voice that did not belong to her. The Force was not always clear, but it was always present. And Qui-Gon listened, not because he sought secrets, but because he no longer trusted silence. Each mission became a lesson, not in the Jedi Code but in the Force itself. It taught him patience, it taught him humility, and it reminded him the galaxy was not made for the Jedi. The Jedi were made for the galaxy. But the Order had forgotten this, and Qui-Gon was beginning to see. They didn't want to remember. He began to make decisions without waiting for approval. Small things, but enough. Intervening when others would have observed. Helping where others would have mediated. Trusting the Force instead of the Council. Reports came back, marked as non-standard behavior. But no action was taken. They didn't know what to do with him. He wasn't disobedient. He simply moved differently, like a shadow that never stepped out of the light, but never stood still long enough to be caught by it. He was still a Jedi, still loyal, still carried the code in every breath. But something had changed. He no longer asked what the Council expected of him. He only asked what the Force required. And in those quiet corners of the galaxy, among people who didn't know his name, he found a kind of clarity the Temple had never offered. The Jedi were drifting, bound by protocol, shaped by their past. But Qui-Gon, he was learning to move with the current. Even if it meant floating further away from the Order that raised him, there was no moment of decision, no loud confrontation. No broken lightsaber on the steps of the temple, just quiet distance. Day by day, mission by mission, Qui-Gon was still a Jedi, but the Order no longer recognized the way he walked. He didn't mean to separate himself, but the Force kept showing him things the Council refused to see. A senator hiding slavery behind trade laws, a Jedi Knight suppressing visions to avoid Council reprimand. A planetary leader who used peace talks to stall for war. Each time, Qui-Gon intervened. Not with arrogance, with certainty. He didn't wait for votes, didn't ask for permission. He followed the Force. And when questioned, he offered no apology. He wasn't trying to be right. He was trying to be present. He began to speak less in meetings. Not out of pride, out of clarity. He didn't need their agreement to follow his instincts. He only needed silence. But silence turned into suspicion. Some masters whispered that he was too bold. Others said he had grown dangerous. Mace Windu called him unpredictable. Ki-Adi-Mundi called him misguided. Even Yoda, who had once trusted him with high council assignments, now spoke with caution. But no one could deny his success. He stopped wars before they began. He calmed systems that had spun toward chaos. He found truths others missed, because he was listening to something deeper. Not just the will of the Jedi, the will of the Force itself. And it was calling him away from doctrine. He began training Obi-Wan differently, not just in lightsaber forms or Jedi ethics, but in trust. He told him to listen to his instincts, to feel every moment, to question silence, not to rebel, but to remain alive inside the code. It made their bond harder, more tense, but more real, because Qui-Gon no longer believed in obedience without presence. He was not above the Order, he had simply stepped beside it. And from there, the view was different. He saw how the Jedi had wrapped themselves in procedure, how they mistook consistency for wisdom. He saw the temple's children being taught what to suppress, not what to feel. He saw the council hesitate, even when lives depended on motion. He didn't hate them. He still believed they served good. But they had grown still, and the Force was not still. So he walked forward, alone, not to fight the Order, not to leave it, but to remind it that the Force was not a law to be obeyed. It was a current to be followed, even when it went places no Jedi dared walk. He turned down a seat on the council, twice, not as rejection, as honesty. He knew he would not sit still. He knew he would not vote to maintain balance if he could act to restore it. He wasn't ready to lead the Order, because the Order wasn't ready to move. He believed in peace. He believed in discipline. But above all, he believed in the Force. And the Force had shown him that sometimes peace must be broken to be restored. He remained a Jedi in name, but in practice, he had become something else. A wanderer, a listener, a shadow within the light. The council couldn't see where he was going, but Qui-Gon didn't need them to, because the Force could see, and that was enough. Tatooine was never meant to matter. It sat beneath twin suns, dry and lifeless to the Republic, buried so far from Coruscant that the Jedi rarely spoke its name. But the Force had no borders, and sometimes the will of the Force waited in places others forgot. Qui-Gon didn't know why he felt uneasy the moment they landed. He didn't say it aloud, but he felt it. The wind was dry, but it carried something deeper, a stillness that wasn't peace, a silence that wasn't sleep. He walked with caution, his robes brushing against the coarse sand, as the boy he'd just met led him through the outskirts of Mos Espa. Anakin Skywalker, 9 years old, a slave, born to a single mother, and strong, impossibly strong in the Force. It hadn't made sense. Even now, it didn't. No father, no training, no control. And yet, when Qui-Gon looked at him, the Force didn't ripple. It roared, like it had been waiting. It hadn't started with a vision or a prophecy. It had started with a feeling, a moment in Watto's shop, when Anakin had spoken not like a child, but like someone who already knew the truth of others. When he asked if Qui-Gon was a Jedi, he wasn't guessing. He was remembering something he hadn't seen yet. Qui-Gon felt it like gravity pulling him closer, not to the boy's power but to the mystery around it. Anakin didn't act like a savior. He didn't want to be one. He just wanted to help, to win, to be free. That night, in the dark, Qui-Gon stood alone outside the boy's home. The sand was cold, the sky open, and the Force spoke clearly, not in words, but in certainty. This boy matters, not because of prophecy, not because of hope, because something about Anakin was untouched, unshaped, still open to become anything. Qui-Gon hadn't felt that in years. Not since he was young. Not since he stood before Dooku and believed the future could be chosen. But with Anakin, it wasn't about choice. It was about fate. The Force had brought him here, to this dust-covered planet, to this half-buried home, to this boy with eyes that saw too far for his age. And it had asked a question, a quiet one, but deep. Will you act? Qui-Gon wasn't sure what Anakin was yet, but he was sure of one thing. He could not walk away. Anakin Skywalker was too perfect. That was the problem. His reflexes were impossible, his awareness unnatural, his kindness steady, effortless, sat beside instincts built for battle. And the Force didn't move through him like a river. It exploded outward, like it was trapped inside him, waiting for the galaxy to notice. Qui-Gon watched him closely in those first hours, not as a master studies a student, but as a man studies something he cannot explain. Anakin could race pods at speeds no adult could survive. He could feel moods in a room before anyone spoke. He dreamed of freedom, not like a child does, but like someone who believed he was already free. He didn't complain about slavery. He accepted it, not because he liked it, but because something inside him whispered that it would end. And maybe, on some level, he already knew how. Qui-Gon asked Shmi gently, carefully about the boy's father. She said there wasn't one. He waited for a pause, for a correction, for a word she'd forgotten. But none came. There was no father, she said. I carried him, I gave birth, I raised him. I can't explain what happened. It wasn't a lie. It was something worse. It was truth, with no answer. Qui-Gon had heard whispers in the archives, old myths, forbidden doctrines, the idea of a vergence, a sudden burst of force power gathered in a single place or person. But this wasn't theory anymore. It was a boy standing in front of him. It made sense why the Council would fear it. Even he felt it, the weight behind Anakin's presence. Too pure, too still, like he didn't grow into the Force, but was born from it. Qui-Gon didn't believe in prophecy, not the way others did, but he believed in the living Force, in its whispers, its warnings, its currents. And it was louder than ever. The boy had to leave with them. Tatooine could not hold him, and Qui-Gon knew, if they walked away now, they would regret it forever. So he made a plan, a pod race, a gamble, a desperate act of chance, not to prove Anakin's worth, but to buy his freedom. And when the boy crossed the finish line, bloodied and wide-eyed, Qui-Gon felt something shift. He had seen courage, he had seen sacrifice, and he had seen, in that moment, that Anakin would follow him anywhere, not because of destiny, but because he trusted him. It was a kind of loyalty Jedi were never meant to accept. But Qui-Gon didn't care. He took Anakin's hand, and they left the desert behind. But even as the stars pulled them toward Coruscant, he knew the real storm hadn't started yet. The Temple would not understand. The Council would not agree. And still, Qui-Gon felt no fear. Because for the first time in years, the Force was clear. Coruscant was always louder after Tatooine. Its air hummed with speeders, its light never dimmed. And yet, as their ship broke through the clouds, Qui-Gon felt only quiet. He stood behind Anakin as the boy pressed his face to the viewport. The child's eyes caught every reflection, every spark of the skyline, as if he'd never seen color before. He smiled, hopeful, unaware. Qui-Gon wished he could stay that way. The temple was colder than he remembered. Its silence wasn't peace anymore, it was judgment waiting to be spoken. He walked with purpose, but he could already feel the stares. Word had spread. A Jedi Master had brought a slave child to Coruscant. Before the Council, he stood without hesitation. Yoda, Mace Windu, Ki-Adi-Mundi, Plo Koon. Eyes older than the Republic itself. He told them everything. The pod race, the strange birth, the feeling in the Force that still burned in his chest. They listened. They always did. But when he said, "He is the chosen one," the stillness in the room became ice. Windu's voice was careful. The prophecy is vague. Ki-Adi-Mundi's was sharper. Born of the Force, impossible. And Yoda's eyes closed, not in doubt but in sorrow. Clouded. This boy's future is. They tested Anakin anyway. Heart rate, focus, fear. The boy tried to be calm. He looked to Qui-Gon once, seeking reassurance. And Qui-Gon nodded a small gesture that said, "Trust me." When the test ended, the verdict came quietly. He is too old, too emotional. His fear is dangerous. Qui-Gon's jaw tightened. He'd heard these words before. Rules recited to preserve comfort, not truth. Master Yoda, he said softly, I have seen the will of the Force act through this child. If we ignore it, we go against the current itself. But the Council's eyes did not move. They did not challenge him, they dismissed him. Your thoughts betray your feelings for the boy, Windu said. Your judgment is clouded. It was almost enough to make him laugh. For years he had been accused of listening too much to the Force. Now they accused him of listening to it again because it spoke louder than they could. He turned to leave, but Yoda's voice stopped him. Care for him, you do, but train him, you cannot. The Council will not allow it. There was no anger in Yoda's tone, only regret. Qui-Gon bowed, but he didn't agree. When the doors closed behind him, he felt the final thread of his trust snap. Not because they denied him, but because they feared what they could not control. He found Obi-Wan waiting in the hall. The young Jedi's expression was torn between respect and confusion. They don't trust him, Obi-Wan said. Neither do you, Qui-Gon replied. Obi-Wan hesitated. I'm trying to understand. Qui-Gon looked at him, really looked. He saw the same discipline he once admired, the same caution that had once kept him alive. And he realized that, if he died tomorrow, the Order would shape Obi-Wan into another Council member. It wasn't anger he felt, it was sorrow. He is the chosen one, Qui-Gon said quietly. You must see it. Obi-Wan wanted to argue, but the certainty in his master's voice silenced him. When Qui-Gon returned to Anakin's quarters, the boy was waiting by the window. His hands were pressed against the glass, watching the speeders drift through the fog. They don't want me, do they? Qui-Gon didn't lie. No, they're afraid. Anakin looked down. His voice trembled, but it wasn't anger. Will you teach me? Qui-Gon paused, and in that breath, the Force answered for him. Yes, he knew what it meant. Defiance, disgrace, exile perhaps, but he didn't care, because for the first time in his life, the Force had shown him something clearer than any Council vision. A future that began and might one day end with this boy. The Council's words still echoed long after he left their chamber. Too old, too dangerous, too uncertain. They said it with calm voices, but he could feel what hid beneath their stillness. Fear. The Order was built on control, and Anakin Skywalker was the end of it. Qui-Gon walked the corridors of the temple in silence. He wasn't angry. He was tired. Years of obedience had taught him how to bow without believing. But this was different. This was the first time the Force had shown him something the Council refused to see. He would not turn away again. Obi-Wan followed him through the halls, speaking carefully. Master, if you defy the Council, they may strip you of your rank. Qui-Gon didn't stop walking. Then I will not need rank. Obi-Wan tried again. Are you sure this is the will of the Force? Not just your hope? Qui-Gon finally looked at him. His eyes were calm. It is both, and perhaps that is what they've forgotten. The next day they were sent to Naboo. A blockade, a negotiation, a simple mission at least. That was what the Council believed. But the Force had already decided otherwise. The boy came with them. He shouldn't have. But Qui-Gon refused to leave him behind on Coruscant, trapped by politics and fear. He told Anakin to stay close, to watch, to learn. He didn't promise safety. He only promised truth. When the ship entered the atmosphere of Naboo, Qui-Gon felt it, that same pull in the Force. It wasn't warning, it was preparation. Something waited there, beneath the calm surface of their mission. The events moved fast, the Queen's capture, the escape, the duel in the hangar. And in that instant, The future revealed itself in flashes of motion and light. Red, black, a double-bladed saber igniting in the mist. The Sith had returned. The darkness that the Council denied for 1,000 years was standing in front of him. And Qui-Gon realized the prophecy wasn't a legend. It was happening now. He fought Darth Maul not as a warrior seeking victory, but as a man trying to keep destiny alive long enough for someone else to see it. Every strike was a question, every block, a prayer. He was fast, but Maul was faster. And in that final moment, as the blade pierced his chest, Qui-Gon didn't feel fear. He felt release. He had done what the Force asked of him. He had believed. When Obi-Wan's arms caught him, his breath came shallow, but his gaze was steady. The world blurred around him, the hangar, the shouts, the hum of energy fading into distance. Only one thought remained. "Promise me," he whispered. "Train the boy." Obi-Wan hesitated. "Master, the Council, promise me." The words came weak, but the meaning carried through the Force like thunder. This was his last act of defiance, and his final act of faith. When his hand fell still, the galaxy shifted. One life ended, another began. The Council held its funeral with ceremony and silence. They spoke of honor, courage, sacrifice, but few spoke of what he truly was, the Jedi who listened when others doubted. And though they didn't know it, his choice had already changed everything. Because the boy he believed in would one day destroy them all and save them. Both truths were written in the same breath. Years later, when the sons of Tatooine set on a new child training beneath Obi-Wan's watch, the wind would carry a whisper across the desert. Soft, distant, eternal. "Remember, he is the chosen one." It wasn't prophecy anymore. It was memory. A voice in the living Force that never died. And somewhere beyond life, Qui-Gon Jinn, the Jedi who defied his order and obeyed the Force, finally found peace. The mission was meant to be simple, a negotiation, a blockade, a dispute over trade routes. But Qui-Gon Jinn had learned long ago that nothing stayed simple in the Republic. Especially when the Force whispered beneath the surface, and it had whispered the moment he stepped aboard the Chancellor's ship. He didn't speak of it aloud, not to Obi-Wan, not to the pilots, not to the delegates, but it was there, tightening like a thread in his chest. A slow ache of warning. Something was waiting. They were sent as diplomats. Jedi were meant to protect peace, not ignite wars. Yet from the beginning, the mission to Naboo had felt wrong. Too quiet, too smooth, like a trap laid long before the players had even arrived. In the silence of the Trade Federation cruiser, Qui-Gon stood still and breathed. The deck hummed faintly beneath his boots. The air was recycled, sterile, but the Force, the living Force, pulsed around him. And in that hum, he heard a shadow. Not a voice, just intent, malice, held like breath before the plunge. He glanced at Obi-Wan. His Padawan was calm, his presence steady, disciplined. But beneath that control, Qui-Gon could feel the younger Jedi's uncertainty. The Council had given them little information. The Chancellor had spoken in riddles. And the Trade Federation, they were not acting alone. He was sure of it. The Sith had been gone for 1,000 years. That's what the histories said. That's what the Council believed. But Qui-Gon didn't trust old beliefs. Not when the Force itself tugged him away from them. It had guided him to strange worlds, to strange truths, and it had never lied. When the Neimoidians refused to open negotiations, Qui-Gon didn't argue. He didn't wait. The moment the gas hissed through the vents, he had already moved. The trap had been sprung. They landed on Naboo not as ambassadors, but as fugitives. Jedi Knights hiding in the jungles like hunted prey. It would have been easy to feel betrayed. easy to let anger rise. But Qui-Gon felt something else. Stillness. This was where he was meant to be. Not in a grand chamber. Not at a temple. Here in the mud, in the leaves, surrounded by life. The trees breathed, the water whispered, and the Force moved. Not through rules or rituals, but through instinct. It guided his footsteps. It led him toward the Gungan who would change the course of their escape. It placed him where he needed to be, even when that place seemed beneath the surface of reason. Jar Jar Binks was not a warrior, not a scholar, not a Jedi, but he was alive. And the Force did not divide beings by status. It moved through all things. Qui-Gon followed that current without question. They entered Oto Gunga, a city hidden beneath the waters. They convinced its leaders to grant passage, and when others would have judged or dismissed the strange, clumsy Gungan, Qui-Gon did not. He simply accepted him, because the Force had placed the creature in his path. And Qui-Gon trusted the Force more than any council, any rulebook, any tradition. As they moved toward Theed, the capital of Naboo, the weight grew heavier. Qui-Gon could feel the Queen's pain even before he met her. Amidst royal robes and political language, Amidala was still just a young girl watching her people suffer. But she stood tall. She did not beg. She did not yield. In her, Qui-Gon sensed something powerful, a quiet resilience. And yet, something else too. Darkness hovered over this world. Not chaos, not disorder, but a design, an orchestration, as if someone far away was pulling strings, pushing events toward an invisible end. When the Queen spoke of going to Coruscant, Qui-Gon agreed, but his eyes lingered on the horizon, on the city, on the towers of Theed where shadows gathered. The Sith had been gone for 1,000 years, but darkness was patient. It could sleep beneath marble. It could hide in diplomacy. It could wear the face of a senator and speak the language of peace. And as the engines roared to life, and the ship lifted from Naboo's soil, Qui-Gon Jinn closed his eyes and listened to the Force. It did not scream. It whispered. A soft warning carried on ancient breath. Not yet, but soon. Coruscant welcomed them with ceremony. Guards, advisors, senators, flashes of chrome and protocol. But none of it mattered. The Queen brought her plea before the Senate, and the Senate did what it always did: it delayed. It argued. It weighed lives against procedure. Qui-Gon watched the chamber in silence, not with surprise, but with quiet grief. The Republic was old, and old things rot from within. He had not come to Coruscant for debate. He had come to find answers. And standing beside the Queen, in the shadows of power, was the one person the Force had not warned him about: Senator Palpatine. Polished, calm, helpful, too helpful. Qui-Gon didn't speak his suspicions. He couldn't explain them. They weren't built from facts. They came from something deeper, a dissonance in the current, like the air before a storm. Palpatine said what needed to be said. He supported the Queen. He listened to the Jedi. He offered guidance without control. But even in stillness, the Force moves. And in Palpatine's presence, it hesitated. There was no time left. The Queen decided to return to Naboo, to fight for her people herself. The Council disapproved. The Senate hesitated. But Qui-Gon understood. She wasn't choosing recklessness. She was choosing dignity. And once again, the Force pulled him back to that broken world. They returned to Naboo under darkness. Past blockades, past patrols, quietly, carefully. And this time, they did not hide. They sought alliance. The Gungans had been dismissed, ignored, insulted. But Amidala knelt before them. She offered not orders, but respect. And they answered. An army rose. While others prepared for battle, Qui-Gon searched. Not for a weapon, not for a strategy, for a faith feeling. Something was wrong beneath the surface of Naboo, not in the swamps, but in the palace itself. A presence had rooted itself there, waiting, watching. Obi-Wan could feel it too, but he didn't name it. The Jedi hadn't seen a Sith in 1,000 years. Even to speak the name was to disturb something sacred. Qui-Gon didn't need to name it. He already knew. The hallways beneath the palace were quiet, cold, made of stone and silence, and in that silence, he felt it, the break in the current, like a scar across the Force. The moment came suddenly. No introduction, no warning, just motion. The figure stepped from the shadows like a wound torn open. Dark robes, horned crown, a lightsaber humming with twin red blades. Darth Maul. He didn't speak, he didn't taunt, he didn't posture. He attacked. Qui-Gon moved with instinct, not thought. His blade met the Sith's in a clash of energy and purpose. Every strike was a question, every parry an answer. Obi-Wan joined him, but they were not equals. The Sith was fast, precise, built for this. Qui-Gon fought to protect. Maul fought to destroy. It wasn't rage that powered him. It was focus, controlled, trained, patient. The duel didn't end in victory or death, only in escape. Maul vanished into the tunnels as quickly as he appeared, and for a moment, the Force went silent again. But Qui-Gon knew. This was no assassin, no rogue warrior. This was a Sith, and he had just stepped out of history. Back above ground, the battle for Naboo began. The Gungan army marched. The Queen's forces stormed the palace. And in the hangar, with tension heavy in the air, Qui-Gon placed a hand on Anakin's shoulder. The boy was scared. He didn't understand, but he trusted Qui-Gon. And Qui-Gon trusted the Force. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew the child was meant to be here in this moment, on this world. Not just a witness, but a turning point. He told the boy to stay in the cockpit, to remain hidden, but nothing about this day would stay in place. Destiny had already moved. The engines would ignite, the battle would rise, and the Sith would return. The doors opened like a slow breath, and on the other side, he was waiting. Not hidden, not stalking, not ambushing. Standing still, centered, calm. Darth Maul. He said nothing. No threats, no anger, no commands, just a stare. As if the moment had already happened 1,000 times in his mind. Qui-Gon didn't wait. The Jedi moved forward with Obi-Wan beside him, lightsabers igniting in one smooth motion. Green and blue against red. Old discipline against new hate. The hangar echoed with the sound of clashing energy, a rhythm of war born in silence. Obi-Wan pushed fast, aggressive, leaping over rails and spinning through the air. Qui-Gon stayed grounded, focused, flowing, relentless. But Maul matched both. He didn't falter, he didn't hesitate. He was trained for this moment, forged in secrecy, sharpened by pain. He moved like a weapon with one purpose: to erase, not to win, to end. The fight broke through the hangar and into the generator complex, a cathedral of motion and light. Catwalks, shields, humming plasma. A place built for power, not people. They moved like shadows between beams, each step a heartbeat, each strike a warning. Qui-Gon felt the Force like wind around him, not guiding, but watching. Even it was holding its breath. Obi-Wan tried to stay close, but the battle split them again and again. Maul's double blade cut space like a gate being closed. It wasn't a duel. It was a separation. At the edge of the energy barriers, timing became everything. One wall shimmered and sealed. Qui-Gon was through. Obi-Wan wasn't. He was trapped behind a beam of light, unable to help, unable to reach. And so he watched. Qui-Gon stood alone now. face to face with the Sith. No words passed between them. There was no more to say. He breathed. Not deeply, not fast, but slow, focused, like it might be his last breath. And perhaps it was. Maul charged. They clashed again, but the pace was different now. Less space to move, less time to think, just strikes, deflections, grunts of effort, and the stillness in between. Qui-Gon wasn't tired, but he wasn't young anymore. And Maul was not like other enemies. He didn't lose balance. He didn't break rhythm. He didn't slow. Each attack came with intention, not to overpower, but to distract, to find the one moment when habit became weakness. And then it came. Qui-Gon blocked high, stepped slightly too close, and Maul struck low, the hilt of his saber smashing into the Jedi's chin, breaking his rhythm. Before Qui-Gon could reset, the second blade came fast straight through his torso. Time didn't stop, but it slowed. Obi-Wan saw it. His master fell to the floor in silence. The light barriers still blocked him. He screamed, but the sound couldn't change the outcome. Maul turned, waiting again. Obi-Wan stood behind the wall, trembling with rage, pain, disbelief. And then the shield dropped. The Padawan charged. Now it was speed versus hatred. Blue against red. Maul pressed with violence. Obi-Wan matched with fury. It wasn't control. It wasn't mastery. It was desperation. They clashed across the narrow walkways until one final blow sent Obi-Wan over the edge, down into the shaft, hanging by a thread. Maul paced above him, victory within reach. But Obi-Wan had one move left. The Force moved through him, sharp, fast, clear. He leapt. His master's saber rose from the floor into his hand, and with one clean strike, Maul fell. Cut in half, dropped into the void, gone. But the damage was done. Obi-Wan ran to Qui-Gon's side. The light was fading from his master's eyes. He whispered a single name, Anakin. Not out of fear, but urgency. He told Obi-Wan to train the boy, not to ask the council, not to debate, to promise, because the future was moving, and the Jedi were not ready for it. Qui-Gon didn't die in fear. He died in belief. A man who saw what others couldn't, and acted when others wouldn't. The chamber was quiet, not in the way a room is silent, but in the way a heart feels when something is missing. Qui-Gon Jinn's body lay still on the ceremonial pyre, robes folded, arms crossed, face calm. The flames had not yet risen, and the galaxy had not yet shifted, but the moment was here. Obi-Wan stood nearby, staring at the man who had shaped his path, broken tradition, and died for a boy the council had refused to understand. There were no speeches, no processions, no temple rites, just the quiet flicker of torches and the weight of unfinished purpose. Across from him, Anakin stood, small, unsteady, eyes wide but dry. He didn't speak. He barely breathed. And in his stillness, there was something deeper than grief, something ancient, as if he was waiting for something or someone. The boy didn't look like destiny. He didn't look like a warrior. Not yet. But Qui-Gon had seen it, felt it, trusted it, even when the others looked away. Now, the one man who believed in him was gone, and the fire was beginning. Obi-Wan watched the flames rise, but his mind wasn't there. It was drifting back through memory, through years of training, arguments, silence, and respect. He hadn't always understood Qui-Gon. He hadn't always agreed. But now, standing at the edge of death, he understood what mattered. Qui-Gon hadn't tried to control the galaxy. He hadn't clung to dogma. He had listened to the Force, to people, to what wasn't being said. And that was what made him different. Not rebellious, not reckless, just willing to feel what others ignored and act when no one else would. The council had arrived late. They watched the funeral from a distance. Yoda, Mace Windu, Ki-Adi-Mundi, masters of wisdom, protectors of peace. But they hadn't come to support. They had come to witness the death of a Jedi who had disobeyed them, the rise of a child they did not trust. And in that space between loss and decision, something changed in Obi-Wan. Not anger, not pride. Resolve. He made the promise. He told Yoda that he would train the boy, no matter what the council said. It wasn't about legacy. It wasn't even about prophecy. It was about trust. A trust passed down in fire, sealed in belief. Later that night, when the stars had returned and the fire had burned low, the wind carried something strange. A voice. Soft, not imagined, real. Obi-Wan turned. But no one was there. And in that moment, he knew Qui-Gon's connection to the Force had not ended. It had deepened, moved beyond life, into something older, purer. The living Force had embraced him. Not as a memory, but as a presence. The Jedi had spent centuries mastering the Force, but few had truly listened to it. Qui-Gon had. And now, he would guide from a place the Council could not reach. The story did not end with his death. It began again in Anakin, in the war to come, in the fall that no one stopped. Qui-Gon's warning had echoed through the Order, but few heard it in time. He was the Jedi who saw too early, who defied too much, who gave everything to protect a boy the galaxy would one day fear. But in the end, he died without regret, not because he was certain, but because he had listened, and the Force had spoken. The light inside the temple dimmed when he died, but the Council said nothing, and the galaxy moved on. It was not unusual for Jedi to fall in battle. What made Qui-Gon different was what lingered after. On the surface of Naboo, the funeral was quiet. No great declarations, no mourning in the streets. Only the hum of the pyre and the slow orange light climbing the faces of those who had stood beside him. To many, Qui-Gon Jinn became a memory that day, a lesson in risk, a warning about defiance. Another Jedi Knight who stepped too far into shadows and never returned. But Obi-Wan knew something was wrong, not just with the loss, but with what came next, because death was supposed to end the bond. But his presence never left. There were moments when the wind felt too calm, when silence filled the room, but it didn't feel empty. There was no voice, no vision, but something remained. The Order ignored it, Obi-Wan buried it, and time passed. Qui-Gon had always seen differently. Even now, the galaxy could not see him, but that didn't mean he was gone. There were whispers not in the halls of healing, but in the old archives, mentions of rituals not taught to Padawans, writings that spoke of consciousness beyond the veil. The Jedi had dismissed them centuries ago, but Qui-Gon hadn't. He had already begun the journey before he died, and that meant death was not his end. The moment his body fell, something else rose. Not in strength but in awareness. His soul did not scatter like starlight. It held together. It watched. It waited. What the Sith pursued with madness and alchemy, Qui-Gon found through surrender, through peace, through letting go. He was not trying to escape death. He was trying to serve beyond it. And in that quiet, he heard something, a stillness older than the Jedi, deeper than the Force they taught. It had no form, no shape, only a feeling of being part of everything, not controlling the Force, but listening to it. His death became a door, and beyond it, something opened, but no one saw it, because the Jedi did not believe it could exist. They had grown afraid of the living force of its chaos, its unpredictability. Qui-Gon had always trusted it, even when it brought pain, even when it cost him everything. And now, in death, it began to trust him back. But he was still learning, still not whole. He couldn't yet speak, couldn't appear. He was a breath between moments, a presence in the stillness. But the Force was not finished with him, because something darker was rising, and someone would need to hear him soon. He never told the Council. Even at the height of his doubt, Qui-Gon Jinn had not broken faith with the Jedi Code. But there were things he could no longer leave to tradition. Things he had to search for quietly, beyond the old archives. It began in fragments, ancient scrolls held beneath the temple, meditation texts written in a dialect no longer taught, visions that came to him during sleep, uninvited, and voices so faint, even he questioned them. While others trained in the external forms of the Force, Qui-Gon had always listened for its breath. In rivers, in wind, in the dying pulse of war-torn worlds. To him, the Force wasn't just energy to control. It was something alive, something with memory. And somewhere in that memory, he believed, was a way to remain. Not as a ghost, not as a shadow, but as something more. The Jedi spoke of becoming one with the Force as a release, a return, but they never spoke of returning from it. That path had been dismissed, forgotten, feared, but not by all. There were legends buried deep in footnotes and oral teachings of those who had walked this line before. Names erased, faces lost, and among them, one whispered figure, a shaman of the wills. The text did not say how this shaman had lived or how they had died, only that they had found a state beyond death. Not eternal life in flesh, but presence, consciousness without form. Qui-Gon became obsessed. During long hyperspace journeys, he would sit for hours in silent trance. During battles, he would sense the breath of fallen soldiers long after their hearts had stopped. In temples on forgotten moons, he would linger behind after the mission was done, meditating beneath ancient stone, listening for answers. He did not do it to defy the Council. He did it because he had seen how fragile life was, and how easily the Jedi turned away from questions that had no clear answer. But he needed answers, because if death was the end, then everything was borrowed time. He began to believe it wasn't. In one vision, he stood alone in a vast field of stars. He could not move. He had no body, but he was aware of every light, every motion, every death. He called it the Shimmer. It wasn't a place, it was a state of surrender, of dissolving without disappearing. It terrified him, but it also gave him peace. He confided in no one, not even Obi-Wan. The few Jedi who had pursued this path before had been cast out, or worse, forgotten. The High Council viewed such ideas as a corruption of natural law, a gateway to the very attachments Jedi were warned to avoid. But Qui-Gon wasn't trying to live forever. He was trying to listen forever. There were things he still needed to say, warnings the Council ignored, truths the galaxy wasn't ready for. And one day, when his body failed, he didn't want those truths to vanish with it. So he trained, not his body, not even his mind, but something deeper, his awareness, his surrender, his connection to the Force not as a tool, but as a current. He learned to lose himself within it, to let go of identity, of name, of ego, to become only a ripple in the stream. There were times he doubted it, when Obi-Wan questioned his beliefs, when the Council sent him on missions without listening to his visions, when the galaxy moved forward without him. But still, he trained. He learned to follow silence. He learned to feel presence in the void. And in the final months of his life, on a transport passing through the Outer Rim, something changed. He felt the Shimmer again, But this time, it didn't frighten him. He breathed deeply, let his eyes close, and for a moment, the stars around him stopped burning. Time slowed. The Force didn't push or pull, it only was. He knew then, it was working. He wasn't afraid of dying anymore, because he had already started leaving pieces of himself behind. It started as a whisper, not a sound, but a shift in the air. A faint feeling, brushing against the surface of the mind like a distant wind that had traveled far across time. Yoda was meditating deep within the roots of the Jedi Temple when he felt it for the first time. The room was quiet. The galaxy outside was not. The Clone Wars had already begun to consume entire systems, and the Force, it no longer moved like it once did. But that day, something called to him from the beyond. A voice not born from memory, not a vision, not a dream, a presence. It said his name, and it sounded like Qui-Gon Jinn. At first, Yoda did not speak of it. Not to the Council, not to Obi-Wan, not even to himself aloud, because he had lived for 900 years, and in that time he had felt many illusions, many tricks of darkness, many echoes of those who had passed. But this was different. It didn't come through fear or longing. It came with peace. It came again. And each time it did, it grew stronger. Words formed, guidance, questions, even answers. Yoda, the Grand Master of the Jedi Order, found himself in silent conversations with a man who had died years ago, and he began to realize something that shook him far more than war ever had. Qui-Gon had not disappeared. He had returned, but only as a voice. There was no form, no light, no shape, just the sound of calm reason in the storm. And it carried truth the Jedi had long forgotten. That the Force was alive, not a tool, not a code, not a path toward power or control. It was something that breathed through all things, that could not be mastered, only listened to. Qui-Gon had followed it in life, and now he spoke from within it in death. Yoda listened, but even then, he did not yet understand. He could not grasp how such a thing was possible. No Jedi in history had ever retained consciousness after death, not like this. The ancient texts said it could not be done. That identity dissolved into the Force when the body fell. That all became one. But Qui-Gon had separated, preserved, endured. How? The voice told him the truth. On the moons of Obitoku, in the shadowed swamps of a planet no Jedi had walked in centuries, Qui-Gon had trained with spirits older than memory. He had spoken to Shaman of the Wills, the ancient guardians of balance. He had learned that it was not power that opened the way after death. It was love, surrender, selflessness, the very things the Order had forgotten in its hunger for control. And now, from that place beyond time, he was offering the path back. He urged Yoda to leave the war behind, to travel where the Council would not permit, to learn what they would never accept. And for the first time in centuries, Yoda obeyed a voice other than his own. He followed the whisper through the stars. He walked alone into the deep core, into the unknown world of Dagobah, where life teemed in silence and the Force moved wild and unfiltered. There, in the heart of the living swamp, the voice met him once more, not as illusion, not as memory, but as presence. Qui-Gon Jinn, the Jedi who had walked away, the Master who had defied the Council, the man who saw the truth too early. Yoda stood in the roots of that world and listened, and in that moment everything changed. Because what Qui-Gon had found was not just a gift, it was a warning. The Jedi were going to fall. The Republic would become an empire. A chosen one would rise, but not the way they had believed. Yoda saw it all, and he knew too late that Qui-Gon had been the only one who was ever truly ready. And now, that voice from beyond the grave, and though would be the last light left when the darkness came. There was no celebration, no announcement from the Force, no storm of light, no chorus in the stars. Just silence, and then, a voice. When Obi-Wan knelt over Qui-Gon's fallen body on Naboo, he thought it was over. He believed his master's wisdom, his strength, his presence had vanished with the final breath. But death was not the end. In the shadows beyond time, Qui-Gon Jinn remained. Not fully spirit, not fully flesh, but aware. He could not move, he could not see. But the Force had not let go. He drifted not in torment, not in peace, but in something else. Something only he had reached. A space between the living Force and the cosmic Force. A bridge no Jedi had crossed and returned from. Not until now. He had done what others had feared to try. He had studied the ancient texts, the rituals, the whispers left buried by masters long forgotten, and he had listened, not to power, but to the Force itself. It took years, not in the physical world, but in that realm beyond time. Qui-Gon's consciousness held on, strand by strand, learning to speak again through a current, not a voice, through the quiet hum of life moving through the galaxy. And then one day, someone heard him. At first, it was Obi-Wan. Not during war, not during conflict, but in the quiet, in the stillness of a lonely ship, in the quiet hours between battles. There were moments when Obi-Wan felt the words before he heard them. Let go. Listen. Be mindful of the living Force. They were not just memories. They were new. Obi-Wan tried to explain, but no one believed him. Not even himself, at first, until Yoda heard it too. On the swamp world of Dagobah, years after the Jedi Order had fallen, Yoda sat in solitude. The galaxy had changed. The war was over. The darkness had won. And then, it spoke. Not a vision, not a memory, but Qui-Gon. His voice, barely a whisper, like wind through leaves, like the calm before a storm. Yoda, one of the oldest and most powerful Jedi in history, had never heard the dead speak. Not like this. He closed his eyes and listened. Qui-Gon did not speak of battles, or revenge, or redemption. He spoke of surrender, of presence, of the path beyond death, one the Jedi had ignored for centuries. Because it could not be taught through rules. It could not be controlled. It could only be lived. The Force had not chosen Qui-Gon for his strength, or his skill with a blade. It had chosen him for his willingness to listen. That was the key. Not dominance, not discipline, but trust. Through Qui-Gon, Yoda learned the first steps. He would later teach Obi-Wan. And through them, the knowledge would survive, even when the Jedi did not. When Obi-Wan left Luke on Tatooine, he did not go alone. He carried Qui-Gon's voice with him, not as a guide, but as a reminder that even in failure, there is still purpose, that even death is not silence. Qui-Gon never returned in the way legends told. No glowing figure walked the halls of the temple. No spirit summoned armies from the grave. He returned in the smallest moments, in the breath before action, in the voice that tells you to stop, in the space between knowing and believing. He did not become immortal for power. He became immortal because the Force allowed it, because someone finally listened. And when the time came, when Luke Skywalker would one day stand on the edge of darkness, guided by voices he did not fully understand, it would be Qui-Gon's path that led them all. The first Jedi to die and yet remain, not to fight, but to teach, not to control, but to awaken. Qui-Gon Jinn had fallen on Naboo, but the Force never let him go. And in the end, he became something greater than a Jedi. He became the first light that never faded. The Order remembered him as the Jedi who defied them. But even that memory was incomplete. They saw his disagreements. They heard his voice rise in council chambers. They knew he walked out when others bowed their heads. But they did not see the seed he planted beneath it all. When Qui-Gon Jinn died on Naboo, many in the temple saw it as the end of a difficult Jedi. Some mourned, some quietly breathed easier, and some simply moved on. But the Force did not. Because even if the Order forgot him, the Force did not. It still carried his voice. Not in grand visions or prophecies, but in quiet echoes that lingered in the minds of those who had once stood beside him, and especially in the heart of the boy who survived him. Obi-Wan never admitted it out loud, but in the days after Naboo, he looked for Qui-Gon everywhere, in the sound of temple wind chimes, in the stillness of meditation chambers, in the flicker of light through Jedi archives. And in that silence he began to understand something the Council never had. Qui-Gon wasn't just resisting them, he was trying to save them. The Order had grown proud, politicized, removed from the galaxy they were sworn to protect. Qui-Gon had seen this coming, and he had pushed against it. Not out of arrogance, but fear. Not fear for himself, fear for what the Jedi were becoming. He knew they were drifting into blindness, and he tried to anchor them to the Force one last time. Not the code, not the doctrine, but the living, breathing Force that flowed through every life, every choice, every whisper of instinct that didn't fit within Council doctrine. And he paid the price for it. He was dismissed, overruled, mocked, and then forgotten, but not by the Force, and not by the ones he had shaped. Because the truth is, Jedi do not change the galaxy by living forever. They change it by planting something that grows long after they're gone. And that's what Qui-Gon did. In Obi-Wan, in Anakin, even in those who once doubted him. He didn't build a legacy through victories or fame. He built it through quiet acts of defiance, through choices that seemed small at the time, through a whisper that kept moving forward even after his voice went still. And though he never lived to see it, that whisper would one day rise louder than the Senate, louder than the Sith, louder than the Jedi themselves. A whisper that said, "There is still another way." After Naboo, Obi-Wan became a master, not by age, not by readiness, but by fire. The moment Qui-Gon fell, the weight passed to him. He took Anakin's hand, not with certainty, but with duty. It was not his choice. It was Qui-Gon's dying will. And so he carried it. But in the quiet moments, he feared it. Not because Anakin was dangerous, not because the boy was reckless, because Obi-Wan knew he wasn't Qui-Gon. He remembered the way his master had moved, not with authority, but with presence. Qui-Gon didn't command the Force. He listened to it, and when it spoke, he followed, even if it led him alone. Obi-Wan tried to mimic that, but it never felt the same. He loved Anakin, trained him with patience, defended him when others whispered. But deep down, Obi-Wan knew he was walking in shoes that didn't fit. The bond Qui-Gon might have built was something he could never quite recreate, because Qui-Gon had seen something others hadn't, something in the way the Force bent around Anakin like wind around flame. He didn't see a warrior. He saw a threshold, something that stood between eras, between codes, between destinies. But Obi-Wan had not seen that. Not clearly. He saw a boy with power, a boy with anger, a boy he had sworn to train but not one he truly understood. So he fell back on discipline, rules, structure, everything Qui-Gon had warned against. And for a while, it worked. Anakin grew, became a knight, fought with valor, loved with intensity. And yet, beneath it all, the same restlessness pulsed. Because no one taught him how to be what Qui-Gon saw, and no one dared try, except the Sith. When Anakin fell, the galaxy blamed many. The Council, the Senate, Palpatine. But in quiet moments, Obi-Wan blamed himself. He had trained Anakin the way the Council trained him, but Qui-Gon would have trained him the way the Force intended. And that was the difference. In that failure, Obi-Wan came to understand his master more than he ever had in life. Qui-Gon hadn't been a rebel, he had been right. And so, from exile on Tatooine, Obi-Wan began again, watching over Anakin's son, whispering the old teachings, letting go of control, and waiting, not for revenge, not for justice, but for hope. Because that's what Qui-Gon had passed to him. Not a lightsaber, not a lesson, but the courage to believe in one person, even when the galaxy had stopped believing in anything. That's what the Council never understood. Qui-Gon didn't just defy them. He freed the ones who came after him to choose differently. He was only 9 years old when it happened. A blur of light, a locked door, a scream he couldn't reach. Anakin Skywalker watched Qui-Gon Jinn die with no weapon in his hand. No defense, no power, just helplessness. And something inside him froze that day. Qui-Gon was the first man in his life who had looked at him and seen something more than a slave. Not a soldier, not a tool, not a project, just someone worth saving. It wasn't the Jedi code that brought Qui-Gon to him. It wasn't duty, it was something else. Something Anakin couldn't name, but felt deep in his chest every time Qui-Gon listened when others ignored, paused when others pushed, smiled when others judged. And then, just like that, he was gone. Anakin carried the guilt quietly. He shouldn't have stayed behind, should have run faster, should have been stronger. But more than guilt, he carried confusion. Because after Qui-Gon, everything changed. Obi-Wan stepped into his call. Life like a shadow that couldn't quite become sunlight. He tried, he cared, but he was careful where Qui-Gon had been open, firm where Qui-Gon had been patient, bound where Qui-Gon had been free. Anakin felt it. The way the other masters looked at him, the way the Council debated behind closed doors. He knew he was not fully accepted. And the one man who had believed in him fully was buried under stone. So he buried something, too. Hope. Years passed, but that wound never closed. Anakin became stronger, but not calmer. Wiser, but not more peaceful. He learned to protect, but not to trust. Because the one Jedi who had ever trusted him first without condition was the one who had no time to teach him how. And so the prophecy became a weight, not a path. He didn't want to be the chosen one. He just wanted to be someone Qui-Gon would be proud of. But every time he failed, every time he doubted, every time he felt fear and reached out for something solid, Qui-Gon wasn't there. And neither was anyone who truly understood him. That's how darkness works. Not as a sudden turn, but as a long walk alone. Anakin never wanted to destroy the Jedi. He just wanted to feel like he wasn't the only one who saw what was broken. Qui-Gon had seen it, but his voice had been lost in silence. Anakin tried to live without it. But when the war came, and the night grew longer, that silence became unbearable, and the galaxy paid the price. In the old days, Jedi didn't speak of the dead. They moved on, accepted loss, let the Force carry the fallen into memory. But Luke Skywalker was not raised in the old ways. He was raised in shadow, born into war, taught by ghosts. And one of those ghosts whispered a name he had never heard, yet somehow felt. Qui-Gon. Not in a vision, not in a dream, But in the quiet moments when he questioned everything, when the path of the Jedi felt brittle, and the old texts felt cold, there was something else. A warmth, a presence, like someone watching, not with judgment, but with hope. He asked Ben, once his old master, long gone into the Force, if there had been others like him. Jedi who questioned, Jedi who loved, Jedi who walked away from the council, not because they were angry, but because they still believed. Obi-Wan didn't say much, but he said a name, Qui-Gon Jinn. And Luke began to understand. The Jedi were not lost because they were defeated. They were lost because they had forgotten how to listen. Qui-Gon never forgot. He had listened to the Force, to the people, to the forgotten. Even in death, he reached across the veil, not to lead, but to remind that the Jedi were never meant to rule. They were meant to serve, not governments, not codes, but life. Luke carried that lesson, not as doctrine but as instinct. He taught it to Leia, to the children who followed, even to the ones who turned away. He did not always succeed, but he did not forget. And when the galaxy grew quiet again, after wars had burned and legends had faded, Luke stood alone, staring at twin suns, not in sorrow, but in peace. Because he had remembered the man who stood there once before him, not as a warrior, not as a master, but as a Jedi who disobeyed to protect one child. And in that defiance had planted the first seed of change. Qui-Gon's legacy was not power, it was permission. Permission to question, to feel, to hope. And in the end, that legacy did not die. It became a path, not for the Jedi of the past, but for the ones still to come.